go ahead and call our special city council meeting. It is 6:01 and today is November 5th, 2018. Rachel, are we live? Thank you. Tonight, we have 3 items on our agenda for this special city council meeting. The first is a discussion regarding occupancy limits. The second is the proposed ordinance 2018-19, planned affordable development as a high-density affordable housing overlay. And then finally, proposed ordinance 2018-20, an assured workforce housing policy. Just noting, the first item on our agenda is discussion, and the other 2 are discussion with possible action. Let's get started. I do want to say that each one of these topics we could sit for a day and deliberate. So I wanted to just have an agreement of time that we wanted to allocate to each item. I would like to propose that our occupancy limits discussion be limited to 30 minutes. And then we go 45 minutes for the PAD and 45 minutes for the workforce housing policy. Does anybody want to add to those numbers? No. Or subtract? Subtract. Okay, well, you can't subtract. I'm going to say we have to at least spend that much time on each.
And then I presume if we run out of time on one of those, we'll discuss what's happening next, because as you have said, that's probably not enough for any of them, so.
Yeah. Well, if we find ourselves struggling and not at completion for any of these, I mean, I think our goal tonight is to get specifically the PAD and the assured workforce housing policy directions back to staff to make revisions so that we can get a document that we hope to pass at our November, is it 11th or 13th meeting? 13th. The 13th meeting. That's critical for us to do because of the constraint that we put on ourselves with the, help me with what it's titled, the
workforce housing ordinance.
The workforce housing ordinance, the land use.
That's the assured housing is the same thing as the workforce housing ordinance.
Okay. So, so we really need to have drafts ready to go. Better would be for us to take more time tonight. If we don't think 45 minutes for each of the items is enough, then speak now.
Place to start.
The place to start. Well, and then what we can do is after the first, move on to the second, and then go back and revisit. But I think it's worth it for us to try to meet those. I think comments have been made, documents have been reviewed, and really what we need to do is come up with, with the conversations, the critical conversation we need to have and suggestions to staff. Does that fit, Jeff, with your presentations or intros that you want to make?
We can work whenever we need to work. If they need to discuss something.
Okay.
So we don't have a deadline on the occupancy limits discussion, correct?
Correct.
That's correct.
So we could also put that at the end, and then if we decide that we're having a higher priority discussion about the other 2, bump that.
Well, the only problem with that is that it's noticed to be first, and I think we have people here interested in the conversation. So out of respect for the public, I think we need to have that first. We could shorten that time. We could shorten our discussion on occupancy limits.
Well, doesn't it kind of interact with the PAD?
It kind of does.
So.
Yeah.
Well, maybe it's worth just putting into context why the occupancy discussion right now with these 2 ordinances.
Well, I mean, that's really just getting us started. So let's just say that our last 2 items will be 45 minutes to an hour. and let's keep it as noticed, and let's begin. Okay. Is that okay? Feel okay? All right. So the discussion regarding occupancy limits. Jeff or Summer, did you have something that you were prepared to present?
Sure.
Okay.
I have all kinds of stuff.
I think the theme for tonight is brevity for all of us.
Okay. So first of all, we've talked about the Keating memo, and I think a lot of people have been using that as a standard. General Counsel came out with this, the General Counsel for HUD, and said that HUD and the Department of Justice would consider an occupancy policy of 2 persons per bedroom to be reasonable. Later on in that very same memo, I'm definitely abbreviating everything, he starts talking about the size of bedrooms, the layout of the house, so that 2 per bedroom rule may not necessarily hold true. What has happened because of that then, and out of a lot of case law, is that a 2+1 has been more acceptable and not as restrictive. The courts have felt that having just a 2 per bedroom eliminates kids on some level, and you can't, that is a protected class. Children are a protected class in this sense. And so the 2+1 gives, in a single bedroom, you'd have 2 adults and 1 child. If you had a 2-bedroom, it'd be 4 adults and 1 child, so 5 could live there. So that right now is becoming more of a standard across the country, and states and local jurisdictions are beginning to adopt that. Not to say that is the only approach, because there are codes that actually spell out you need 120 square feet for the first adult, 50 square feet for the next, so you could have 2 adults in actually a 100 square foot bedroom, and it goes on and on and on. It can get very involved at that stage. So.
Okay.
Any questions so far?
Nope.
So any occupancy standards that or limitations that we adopt, they have to be based on neutral standards. The Fair Housing Act doesn't cover reasonable occupancy restrictions regarding a maximum number of occupants permitted to occupy a dwelling. And that is apparently part of the discussion that we'll have tonight. Reasonable limitations, and certainly Utah law has that term scattered throughout. Actually, it's pretty heavily in the code. And so the occupancy standards, though, must be neutral standards. And we can cap the number of occupants per dwelling. They're usually based on floor space or number of rooms, and serve to protect the health and safety by preventing overcrowding. When we get to the pad, I have a little caveat that I think will. So California originally adopted the building code, or the property maintenance code, that talks about a dwelling must have at least 1 room that has 120 square feet of floor area, and any other habitable rooms must be 70 square feet. However, now this has been changed in the code that any habitable room has to be 70 square feet. And we'll get into more detail in the pad when we get there. And here's that. If more than 2 persons occupy a room used for sleeping, the floor area is required to be increased at a rate of 50 square feet for each occupant in excess of 2. And I mentioned also that they recently adopted the 2+1 formula. Okay, we talked about the protected classes. Also, the Fair Housing Act has protections against discrimination on the basis of familial status. And that's actually, I think, a very large part of this discussion, as well as how we're going to frame how many people can live in a house. So what is considered reasonable? allows providers to adhere to local, state, or federal restrictions. If not, if there's not a code in place in various sections of the country, they can actually rely on a nearby community that may have some kind of standards. But all the time, they have to be able to show that whatever they're doing, as far as the limitations, it's based on a reasonable code or other ordinance. It cannot be more restrictive.
I'm sorry, can you go back to the last slide? I was reading the very final paragraph, and it was something about septic.
Right.
Oh, I like your transitions, by the way.
Oh, thanks.
Get vertigo.
I'm wondering if they flip up the other one.
It's one more.
One more. There you go. Oh, they do.
Oh.
One more.
There's septic capacity right there on that paragraph just above the bottom one.
Oh, okay.
Physical limitations.
So it could be based on other physical limitations such as sewer septic capacity.
Right.
Okay. So like, however, for us, that would be like a sewer line because we have unlimited capacity, unless it was like a septic.
But if a unit sat on a piece of property that had a septic tank, that could limit.
But nobody in the city,
And not in our case, but
not new development.
that's what
anyway.
this is.
Yeah, got it. Thank you. Thank you.
We do have homes on septic though, but
Not
there's
for
some-
long.
not very many of them.
Can I just ask a question about the last paragraph on that last slide? If a housing provider stipulates fewer occupants. So if the city were to adopt a different standard than we have currently, which, I mean, is just the family distinction, which I understand the discussion around that, would that have any direct implications for landlords in the city? Or say renting a house? And say the city adopted a 2+1 standard.
Well, they'd be bound by it, first of all, and if they were sued for housing discrimination, they might be able to interpose that requirement as a defense. But it would be binding on landlords. I mean, it's an occupancy standard. It would apply, and it would need to be applied uniformly. So, does that answer your question?
Yeah, but I'm wondering practically, I mean, this is in effect a seller's market, and so landlords typically have a lot of choices in terms of who they rent to. Like, would this practically be used against a landlord who, say, from a pool of...
There are a number of cases that have come down over the years where, for example, families have alleged discriminatory housing practices based on landlord behavior. So, if a landlord refuses to rent an apartment to a family with a lot of kids, that's actionable and can be actionable. Those kinds of, if we put occupancy standards, they have to be neutral, they have to be applied uniformly, and we also have to recognize that in some cases, even neutral regulations have been set aside if they're unreasonable. So if you have a family with a lot of kids and they're little, maybe it's not a bad idea, maybe it's not a problem to have 3 kids in 1 bedroom. And that's been sort of the thrust of the cases that have developed under Fair Housing Act.
Let's get through the slideshow.
So,
How
yeah.
much, few more slides, or?
I got a million of them.
You got a million. Okay.
Okay, we can go this other route, allowable number of occupants based on the size of the unit, with emphasis on the square footage of the bedrooms. And living areas, I can tell you there are some bedrooms in this town that you could probably sleep 6 or 8 comfortably. And not all of them would be in bunk beds, but there are some large bedrooms in some of the dwellings. So I got to fall back on the definition of family because I think this all fits into this. we're talking about a couple with children, and I do have another whole presentation on that if we need to. But the definition must emphasize the functioning of the household members. But occupancy requirements can be used to achieve an enforceable result by basing the regulations on the neutral standard of the physical area of the dwelling, or use a formula like 2+1. And these are just some examples, Madison, Wisconsin, and this is, to me, pretty confusing when you read through this thing. But there's a lot of, they talk about all their zones and, even
Rumors.
going to going to two or more dwelling units, multifamily stuff, and. Okay. Many questions so far?
Maybe I should let you continue, then I'll save my questions.
So we talked about the health, safety, and capacity concerns a little earlier, and how they influence the implementation of limits on the number of people can live together. We should be cautious when we're figuring this out so that we do not fall prey to Fair Housing Act litigation, and keep within the housing laws. As I mentioned before, families with children under 18 are a protected class and can be disproportionately impacted by overly restrictive policies. So reasonableness. Basically, to ensure that use and occupancy restrictions do not contain unlawful preferences or limitation, and don't contain limits on the number of children or ages of children. Of course, there is an exemption under the Housing for Older Persons Act, which you can have a senior development. Any definition of family or restriction on single-family use should be consistent with fair housing law, especially with the Fair Housing Act's treatment of familial status. Limits on the number of allowable occupants should be implemented with caution, and they should be consistent with local health and safety standards or other reasonable governmental restrictions. If a property is not subject to local or state codes, and this is what I was referring to before, housing provider may adhere to the International Property Maintenance Code or the code of a comparable jurisdiction and document the basis for the standard. And they must be applied equally to all persons, regardless of race, religion, sex, disability status, etc.
Okay,
So that's where we are.
thank you.
I have a question, Jeff.
Sure.
Maybe this isn't exactly where it belongs, but hopefully I can. So far, you've talked about bedrooms, and there is a definition of a bedroom in the building code. What if people do this, or is there a restriction that prevents them from using other rooms to sleep in, such as a family room or a den, if it doesn't have
A walk-in closet.
egress or, yeah.
So there would be nothing unless we stipulate that. We use the bedroom as a standard, and certainly the Keating memo kind of goes to this when they talk about the size of rooms and bedrooms and the layout of the house. And maybe a den would be an acceptable third or fourth or fifth bedroom. It certainly could be that way.
That's kind of why they have the +1 added to the 2 per bedroom. That's
Okay.
where the +1 comes in. They're acknowledging that 2 per bedroom is standard, and we'll do +1 because usually there's another spot in the home you can stick another person. So that's where the +1 is sort of found its way into the code.
Okay.
Just to clarify the +1, Jeff, did you say in that system, if it's one bedroom, it's 2 adults plus 1, and if it's 2 bedrooms, it's still 4 adults +1, it's not 4 adults +2?
No. 4 + 1. So the standard would be the 2 persons per bedroom, plus 1. So if you had 3 bedrooms, it'd be 7 people could stay in the house.
I would like to ask this council right now, just to help the conversation move forward, who among us are in favor of imposing occupancy limits? So I am alone in not being in, and you're a maybe.
I'm a maybe.
Okay.
The thing I struggle with is enforcement.
Yeah.
And how do you prove that you can live in that house? That's what I struggle with. So yeah, I'm kind of a maybe.
Well, and I struggle with the conversation about occupancy limits when our issues are with the effects. And I think if we control for the effects, then it keeps us out of people's bedrooms, which is, kind of the joke about government. And in my opinion, occupancy limits, the reason why we're having this conversation is because we've got an affordable housing crisis, and people are willing to sleep in
Less than ideal standards.
Yeah. They're willing to forego a roomy bedroom. They're willing to take a roommate because of the lack of affordability. So I don't want to punish or displace anybody for doing that right now. And at the same time, I think we can control for the negative effects, but that's my opinion. So if that's not the opinion of this council, then we need to look at options for occupancy limits. So that was a really nice layout of kind of overarching themes or categories or way to go about it. And I'm curious what this, if this council has ideas for.
I actually have another basic question for you, Jeff. So we've all talked about health and safety, but what do we have in terms of guidelines on the health and safety end that says anything about any of this? Just.
The property maintenance code actually has a lot of information in it and a lot of requirements. So you have to meet a certain temperature 3 feet off the floor. It's generally 65 degrees. That has to remain constant regardless of the time of year. Adequate ventilation, adequate lighting kind of came out of all the old tenements, at one time where everything was dark and dreary and they had one window. So that is where the property maintenance code came from. As well, all the machinery and equipment on that property have to be functioning. You have to have screens on your windows. There's just a laundry list of things that have to be met. Can't have your fascia falling off. You have to keep them repaired and everything. So we have used that on several occasions to remove buildings that are substandard.
But when it comes specifically to, is there a health safety provision or any constraints in the health safety world around how many people can be packed into a space? That's what.
Yeah, that's kind of what it was. Yeah, I guess I think about fire and I think about,
right.
Yeah. Well, and I think the memo from Jeff does cite some of the limits based on number of occupants per a certain required number of square footage for bedrooms for the number of occupants in a dwelling. I mean, those provisions are there. Correct me if I'm wrong, Jeff.
So let's take this as an exercise. A 1,200. Gosh, what's the average size of a Moab single-family residence? 1,200? Let's go 1,200. With that formula for health and safety and that square footage, 1,200 square feet, what would be the number of occupants?
I would have to ask, how big are the bedrooms and how many do you have to start with?
Bedrooms are typically 10 by 12.
Okay, then you would look at the
3 of them.
You look at the layout of the rest of the house. Kitchen could be bigger, so it might reduce a den, or it might reduce a living space elsewhere. The code doesn't necessarily talk, the building code does not necessarily talk about bedrooms and other areas. They use habitable space. And I do have something I can talk about.
Right, so like this habitable space, if it was the 1,200 square feet
Sure.
of habitable space, what, in that scenario you were just talking about, can we
Well-
come to a number here?
I mean, if you use a 50 square foot minimum, which is one of the requirements under the property maintenance code, you could have, let's say you had
24
hypothetically three bedrooms that are 10 by 10, 100 square feet each. That could conceivably be a dwelling for 6 people.
It'd be 12 bedrooms.
Plus one.
Plus
Plus one.
Or 24, yeah.
Oh, it's 70?
Yeah.
Well, but then it says
Habitable space.
minimum of 50 square feet of floor area for each occupant.
Yeah.
But in that
Which may be the number of people we're seeing, and so maybe what I'm suggesting is that even if we looked at that, even in looking at health and safety, we're really concerned about mitigating the impacts of number of residents rather than controlling just the number as they are. If we do a better job of that impact mitigation, then I don't know, then it's less about the occupancy limit and more about the
Is it more about the external appearance and the
upkeep.
parking and the upkeep versus actually how many people are in the house?
I think the parking is tied to the other standards that we have under discussion about how much parking we require, and if there's unlimited, the total occupancy does relate to that. So totally acknowledging the housing crisis, we are also trying to balance some of the impacts that are happening on neighbors. And I mean, that's the reality. We have to, I mean, if we go too far with density, I think there'll be pushback.
Yeah.
And so I think, I mean, I want to move forward with increasing the housing, but not so much that there is a significant backlash that could set us back years, potentially, or future council years. And I feel like 2 + 1, I mean, in the example just cited, that could be 7 adults, which is still quite a significant, if you get many houses like that on a block, I think it gets noticeable. So I'm okay with that
1,200
standard.
square feet is 100 square feet bigger than my house, and I would not want 7 people in my house.
Jeff, may I? So, Jeff, thank you. 3 easy questions, relatively straightforward. First of all, in your revised zoning code, which we have not blessed yet, you've replaced the definition of family with occupancies, or households, I should say. Okay.
Right.
So are you still suggesting that we focus now on occupants now as opposed to family definitions?
No, not at all. The definition of family can have an impact or be impacted by what we adopt as far as these standards. So if there's a couple with 8 kids and they only have 3 bedrooms, I guess the question would be, where do those other kids sleep?
But we're still going away from using family as.
Right, and going to household.
Right, I think that's
Right.
what.
Yeah,
yeah,
that was my
And so that's something, yeah. So it will depend on how that household definition will be defined
You don't
at some
anticipate
point.
a relatedness clause creeping back into our house?
No, in fact, we would really want to not have that happen.
One of the reasons I ask is that I got into, over the weekend, into the county's high-density overlay ordinance as they've formulated it so far. And they do have a definition that includes a mixed bag use of family, relatedness, plus unrelated people. And that surprised me because I thought they'd be governed by the same stuff as we are.
They are governed by the same stuff you are.
Yeah, they certainly are.
Necessarily because your neighbor's doing something doesn't mean you to follow suit.
What about that example from Madison? Because that seems like, from what we've heard, that
What
wouldn't
did
be
you-
acceptable either.
It probably is questionable. You're right. Because it talks about the number of related persons in a,
So do you anticipate then that's something they'll have to change then, or to be compliant?
eventually. Well, even state law now talks about 4 unrelated people living in a home, so it's,
Well, that's
we're
my
starting
next,
to see an emergence of, I guess, across the country at this stage, where they're trying to bring their codes into compliance with federal law.
I feel like we've talked about this a lot, and I want to just stay really focused on this occupancy limits.
okay, I got 2 more questions. That covers the first one, thank you. David and Chris pointed out that he thinks, if I got this right, correct me if I'm wrong, Utah State Code requires that any dwelling be able to accommodate at least 4 occupants?
I'll read you the code or the state law provision. It says that a single-family limit means the number of unrelated individuals allowed to occupy each residential unit that is recognized by a land use authority in a zone permitting occupancy by a single family. And then there are some definitions, but as applied to Moab, or a city the size of Moab, the single-family occupancy limit cannot be less than 4. So conceivably, if you could have as I read that, if we have a 1-bedroom apartment, you could have a family of 4 living in that.
You could also have 4 unrelated people living in it.
Yeah, or
Correct.
4 unrelated people. Excuse me. But what I would say is, there is a distinction between classifications based on family composition and classifications based on occupancy load. And what I've been trying to do is let's push towards health and safety. Let's push towards what is a reasonable occupancy load for any particular space, rather than making distinctions based on who you live with, who you choose to live with, because the state doesn't have an interest, the state and local governments don't have an interest in who people decide to associate with, whether they're related or not.
Okay. So if you had just a studio, we're going to talk about this later on, a studio apartment in a pad, and we applied the 2+1 rule, that would only that would impose a minimum limit of 3, but that wouldn't fly under state code then, right?
Well, first off, I mean, as I said, there's a distinction between a family designation and an occupancy load. And this standard that I just quoted to you is specifically in response to, it's a college town problem. It's the situation, which to some degree is Moab's problem, just for different reasons, which is that some communities have found crowding and to be a problem, and the way they tried to address it was by a family designation, saying, look, these are single-family homes. You can't have more than X number of unrelated people living together. That's one way of approaching the problem. We're not doing that, or at least I wouldn't recommend doing that. I think a better approach is to look at occupancy standard based on what's a reasonable amount of space for people to live in and be happy.
And not impact their neighbors. Because quite honestly, we're having this conversation about about occupancy limits, not because we're hearing that people living in the homes are uncomfortable, but it's the people living next to them that
The
are
external
uncomfortable.
impacts that are driving the discussion.
Okay.
I agree.
All right, so then Chris, to summarize then, if we were to pass an ordinance with a 2+1 rule and allowed single, 1-bedroom apartments, and we imposed an occupancy requirement of 3 people, then you'd say that you could, what was I here? That you could, by this ordinance, as few as 3 people could occupy this dwelling. We could be sued by the state for not providing a...
No.
There's a differentiation in the state codes. It talks about the number of unrelated people in that
That's right.
definition. It's talking
That's
about the
right.
number of unrelated people, not related people. So
I
with the
understand.
2+1, I'm assuming you're thinking 2 adults and a child.
I think what's getting lost in the discussion is that 2+1 is not a hard and fast rule. No court has held that it is, nor can you apply it as such. It's a standard. You have to take into account if the 2+2 for a single 4 requirements there, and you also always have to take into account with your 2+1 the size of the human beings who are going to be there. So if you have 7 people who want to live in a 1,200 square foot home and they're all adults, that's not the same as a family of 7 who has infants who are twins and taking up lots less space. So the 2+1 is a guideline. It cannot be set, and then that is your hard and fast rule, and you follow it to that. That will get shot down as well.
Okay, thank you. So the final thing is, Caitlin touched on it, is parking. So we can or cannot, see, I've been interested in putting a further restriction on occupancy based on parking on other grounds. I mean, suppose you had a bunkhouse, if you will, forgive me, with a large number of unrelated people there. They all got cars and so forth. If by our bedroom standards and square foot standards, a large number of people could occupy that residence, then if they had a lot of cars, that may be, so far as the neighbors would concern, would be an external event that would be unacceptable.
So let's require lots of parking. Let's restrict height.
We could, but that's another subject that some people are going the other direction. If you're down to 1 parking, but now we're talking about parking, so you may want to postpone that discussion. Yes, that's exactly right. I'm just trying to find out if we could even consider such a rule. In other words, can we even legally write a rule that says the number of occupants is based on the number of bedrooms or square footage, or the number of off-street parking requirements, or some maximum number, whichever is less. Would that be legal to even write that sort of?
For single-family residences, which is where we're having this issue.
Correct.
The standard is 2 off-street parking spaces per dwelling.
Okay.
Not per bedroom, per
Not
dwelling.
per bedroom,
Per dwelling.
Per dwelling.
But that would have to apply to every single household dwelling across the board. If your house is 4 bedrooms, if you're going to impose those requirements, that would have to apply to every single house across the board in the city. So if your house is 4 bedrooms, you now have to have 4 spaces, and yours is 2, you only have to have 2. But you could still run into an issue with an occupancy standard in place and still have an issue with parking.
And if we start forcing them into the yards, because in theory it's supposed to be paved, then now we have another section of code that requires a 70% landscape of the front and side yard. So we're going to start whittling away at some of the things that people enjoy about their neighborhoods, the landscape.
Plus creating impervious.
Right, yeah.
So
I have a few questions. Do we accept gravel, loose gravel, as landscaping?
There's a combination. The definition of landscaping has a combination of trees, shrubs, grasses,
But if
rock.
it's just gravel, probably not.
I think someone could make a case that they're xeriscaping. I don't know. I mean, the definition stipulates that it's a combination of those things. So I think if they did gravel and put a bush in the middle of it, then they would meet the definition of landscaping in our code.
Okay, well, my concern about all this is that, I mean, this all came up, but it's a much larger discussion, and part of the reason it came up is because of how we define the R2 zone. And I mean, I don't know if you ever set different standards, or they're the same across the city. Well, I guess Madison, but we don't know about theirs. It was different for some zones. But a lot of this comes down to the history of the R2 zone and how it's viewed as different. And I think everybody has said they know change is coming. They're willing to accept some change, but there's also there's something that draws people to the R2 too, that I think people are trying to have honored. So I'm just hoping somewhere, it sounds like in a later discussion, we can touch on that, and all of the other related issues we know are tied to here, the code enforcement issues, the longer term parking planning, and the question of commercialization that has been raised, but also if all housing is not the same, and if some places should have a manager on site if they're going to be in here. And I'm also the Property Rights Ombudsman's Office did suggest, if you want to look at communities in Utah that have looked at the 4 unrelated persons you would look at college towns like Provo and Orem and Logan. And I guess my question is, if we're attempting to be a college town and we have had some discussions about frats and sororities, like how are we viewing handling that? So I think it would just be interesting to see what they have, even if we're not going to use it by comparison. But I am
Some of
really
them don't even let you have a coffee pot. I don't think I want to go that far.
But I mean, I am really concerned that we make some kind of plan for the continuation of this discussion, both for the impacts it's having on residents, but also because a lot of them have offered to come to the table towards helping the city reach some kind of good compromise, and I don't want to forego the opportunity that and people's enthusiasm and willingness to help the city make something better.
Well, and I have some compromise, suggestions. One, as we're talking about higher density with the PAD and the assured workforce housing policy, that we favor more parking restrictions. We favor height restrictions, more stringent height restrictions. The thing about a parking lot for a development right now, it could be, cash for the development down the road once we go to autonomous vehicles. So, but for now, we still have vehicles and parking as a big issue for higher density housing. So that's one thing, is not to forego the parking requirements. And then the second is with rentals, like you're saying with the, I'm like getting feedback. I don't know if you can turn it down. But with rentals, the idea that we require somebody renting a unit to have a business license. So, and that's something that we've been talking about among staff, is this idea of licensure for rentals. So if you're renting your unit out and you don't live there, you've got to get a license to do it. And then that gives us more enforcement to be able to contact the owner of the property, as opposed to the uncomfortable interface with people that don't actually own the property. And then you could lose your license if you're not compliant with rules and regulations, and that could be leverage that the city needs for enforcement. So those are two things that I think, or three things: parking, height, and business license for rentals, that I think should be part of our consideration moving forward.
Because this crosses over into some of what we're going to be discussing with Chapter 17, I guess my concern is time.
You mean when you say Chapter 17, the conditional use work that you all have been doing?
Because I know originally people wanted to vote on that on the 13th of November. So,
but I think, if I may, wasn't the point of, I think the whole point though was that the whole household to family definition change wasn't going to in any way change the ability to enforce, or it was no way going to relax any standards for the ability to, for what happens in zones.
Well, I think a lot of it's a communication issue. I mean, first with the community, because I don't know, I think a lot of people didn't understand, and they're starting to understand that the definition needed to change. But I mean, a lot of people, rightly so, because when you look at the code, you look at it and you think, oh yeah, there aren't supposed to be more than 2 unrelated people living here. So part of it is legitimate misunderstanding there, because that hasn't been fixed yet. But part of it is this question of, we're taking boarding houses and rooming houses out. We never defined rooming houses. Now, we don't have bunk houses in there, but the question arises, was a bunk house really a rooming house? I think that is very closely tied to some of this potentially. So I think people would like to know what the timeline is, like what is our plan for helping and taking care of this? And we know there are related questions people have related to code enforcement too. So.
Well, we need clear direction from you as a council then. What should we as staff be, what should we, the royal we, I speak for Jeff and Summer here, what should they be working on in terms of proposals for you? Are we talking about altering things like the parking requirement? Are we talking about, is that what you want us to come back with? Is it a specific occupancy standard per zone? Is it a square footage versus the 2+1? How, we need some direction. Because otherwise, you're right, we're just gonna kind of spin in circles with it. And I don't want this to hold up. And I would hope that the conditional use changes we can get done regardless, as long as there's a time frame we can all acknowledge that we need to work for with regard to occupancy or the effects of densification.
And so today is the 5th, and we do have the council meeting on the 13th. So you're asking for specific stuff, and we should provide ideas like that to you for consideration at the meeting on the 13th when we're reviewing chapter 17.
Wait, I guess I'm not.
No,
you go ahead, David.
I was going to say, so the chapter 17 changes that you all been working on for 6 months, I think.
Yeah.
Right? It's been a long time.
Yeah.
That is teed up for a possible vote on the 13th, right?
Yes.
And I guess I'm hoping that the occupancy / enforcement conversation continues and has a time frame and has specifics to it, but that it is not tied time-wise to that vote on the 13th.
I agree with that, but you're saying that you want to have some type of consideration, so.
I don't think I would be comfortable voting on chapter 17 if the boarding houses and rooming houses are coming out.
Even
Okay, that's good specificity, so that's something for you and staff to look at.
what does that mean?
I don't know. But we can have a dialogue outside. I mean, you can be more, right?
So
add those back in? I mean, I guess I'm not sure
I mean,
what that means.
all of this is in flux, but in our current code, I mean, the rooming house is the closest definition we have to a bunkhouse, and in our current code, it's bulked with B&Bs, and it requires a manager on site. And let's just say, I consider leaving it in a little bit of an insurance policy for residents that somebody's going to work on this because they don't have a lot right now.
So you want us to permit rooming houses in some of the residential neighborhoods?
They're currently in the code under bed and breakfast. They're lumped with bed and breakfast.
We don't have any license to this.
We have no definition for rooming houses.
Right.
You know, I was going to say, let's not have the perfect be the enemy of the good. You've worked really hard on these Title 17 revisions, and I think there's legitimately some public confusion, and I may have inadvertently added to that at the last meeting by not explaining things better. But I'm just thinking that we can work on the occupancy standards or the bunkhouse problem independently of the changes to Title 17. And I think you've heard loud and clear from people that are concerned about that. And if this council makes it a priority for us, we'll do it.
Well, I think to be clear, what you said is boarding house and putting boarding house, like not excluding it from the code. So that is the
No, not just boarding. I mean, we specifically have in our code boarding and rooming houses.
Rooming.
We define boarding houses as specifically not being a rooming house, but we never define rooming house. Create a lot of confusion for the community. Is a bunkhouse essentially a rooming house?
That's why we're taking it all out, because it's
not.
super confusing
but I mean,
and not helpful to have it in there.
What are people on a street with 11 of them streets, 4 out of 11 homes on their street supposed to do?
That's the whole point of having the conversation that you initiated us having around how to deal with occupancy.
But my concern is, I mean, I've been asking for a workshop where the residents could partake. Like, this kind of situation doesn't really help them because they can't participate and bring their ideas. So that's what I would like.
When you say workshop, I've never understood that to mean anything other than a council meeting workshop. So you're talking about like a charrette or an open house or something?
Whatever you want to call it.
So to me, I feel like adopting occupancy standards in the near future, but not contingent or coincident with Chapter 17, will address a lot of these issues. And I feel like resident citizens have the opportunity to communicate their ideas to us already over the past month. And basically what we've largely gotten is a misinterpretation of how to use family to enforce the code. So I'm in favor of considering Chapter 17 at our next meeting and 4/2+1 occupancy standard because it's simple and I'm okay with parking as it is.
Okay, and we gotta move on because we've got 2 other big items to talk about. So hopefully that discussion was helpful for all of us.
Mayor, if I may, I just want to put in my 2 bits worth, if I may. I did write a formula which is much like his 2+1 rule, not necessarily exactly 2, but it has an additional fact. It basically has a maximum occupancy limit of some maximum amount, which could be dependent on standards, what zone you're in, and so forth. It also depends on the number of off-street parking spaces and so on. And I did distribute that around. People have got to look at it. I'd like to submit it to you guys if you haven't already seen it, just for your consideration. I personally am not inclined to approve Chapter 17 as it stands now with a wide open definition of household, because I think it'll be subject to instant abuse.
Okay, this is good. Thank you, Mike, for sharing that. And I guess if anyone's interested in seeing Mike's chart, they could email you, or you could put it somewhere in this room for people to look at, or Summer. Okay. Moving on, proposed ordinance 2018-19, planned affordable development as a high-density affordable housing overlay. I'm very excited that we are talking about the pad. And Jeff, Summer, what is the best way for us to negotiate the deliberation about this agenda item, in your opinion?
One of the issues that we heard a lot about was, is the 70 square feet plus 70 square feet plus a bathroom plus a kitchen large enough for somebody to live in? And maybe we should start right there, just on the size of the units itself.
Because that seems to be a prevailing concern with the current pad.
I'm in favor of just letting the building code govern.
Me too. Exactly. Who's not?
And not having a table, just referencing the currently adopted building code.
I agree.
I agree.
Who's not? Karen? Ronnie? Or Mike?
Yeah, forgive me. State, what is it you want to remove, Kaylin, one more time? I'm sorry. I did not hear that.
Oh, I'm in favor of just letting the currently adopted building code govern and just referencing that.
Oh, that's fine.
So keeping it as is at the 17.68.040, the minimum project area? Oh, that's lot size and project area. Sorry, where's the?
So, I'm sorry, what is the current?
It's, I believe, 120 square feet.
I'm going to zip that real quick.
Go ahead.
Okay. So it used to be that you had a minimum, the first room had to be at least 120 square feet. That's been removed from the code. It was not based on any scientific or health reasons. It was just something that the market would accept and builders would accept. So you had to have at least that 120 square foot area, then 70 square feet for any habitable space after that. Now that's been changed to all, as we notice in red right there in the middle of the page, every dwelling unit, that it goes down to other habitable rooms shall have a floor area of not less than 70 square feet. So all the rooms in a house have to be at least that. So you could have a sleeping area because a kitchen is exempt from this. Bathrooms are exempt from this. You could have a sleeping area and then like a little dining area, 140 at that point. And we have a definition. Let me get down here.
Okay, so in that 140 square foot space, you can, we're saying you can have 2+1? Is that?
That's
be
a
right.
separate issue.
Yeah, yeah. So then there are some minimum fixture clearances in the building code that would.
To the side of your laptop. We heard that maybe some people in YouTube can't hear what you're saying, so.
Nope.
It's on
Right now, there are no adopted occupancy standards of a 2+1. That is not
Right.
in the pad at this point. That is a discussion that you will have.
I
that
mean,
may
what are you asking? Like, if somebody could sleep in the tub, they might sleep in the tub, but they're probably not gonna. If it's a real small place.
No, you'd be surprised, Emily. Yeah.
So with the 140 square feet, if you should choose to have a second room, these types of bathrooms would fit in that. So you could have a 5x9, 6x6, 5x8. And then there could be a kitchen like this, which actually is just a linear thing. So ovens generally are about 30 inches in width. Cabinets are 25 inches deep. So you can kind of see that that might be about 8.5 feet or thereabouts in length. You do have to allow also for an area once you flip down the oven door, so you're not, burning your knees and stuff. But so that would all figure into it, and you certainly would not have to even have this size of a kitchen.
You can have a little kitchenette.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Something even smaller. As long as you have a sink in there, you're good.
So it could be a sink and a toaster oven?
Hot plate, yeah.
Really?
Could be, really.
I actually have a code suggestion that requires a little bit more specificity, because I think actually having a functional kitchen, even if it's very small, is important for affordability.
Because this gets tied to assured housing, so if I was doing, building my required number of units, does that mean that I could do all my units as 140 square feet? Is there anything in the assured housing that talks about minimums? Or that also would just be with the building code?
It incorporates the definitions in PAD, so so the minimum, whatever PAD requires, would also be required under assured housing, unless you mandate something different.
And there is a mix of different levels, like 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom.
Under the affordability concept, it says that it should be a combination of 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, or 3 bedroom units.
Or studio. Yeah, it was interesting there in the red line, it says and or. We're okay with and or, like you could do a mixed unit, you could have 1, 2, 3, 4. So I was just curious about that red line.
Yeah, one of the public comments that came up during the Planning Commission's review of the pad was, why does it have to be 2 and 3 bedroom? Could it be a combination of 2 or 3 bedroom units? So 1 bedroom studio, 1 bedroom, 2 or 3 bedroom units, instead of requiring that you have 2 and 3 bedroom units.
Oh, so that allows for mixed.
Yeah.
Changing,
So
going
that's
from
why
and to
that-
or allows for mixed.
That's why that came
A little
up.
more
Great, okay.
flexibility.
I have a question about that, though, because the way it read before, because I had asked a question at a previous meeting when it said, they all must consist of a combination of 1 bedroom or studio, 2 bedroom, and 3 bedroom. So I remember asking Chris, so does that mean every pad has to be at minimum 3 units because it has to have one of each of those? And he said yes. So by changing that to or, can you have a 2 unit? If you're doing a combination, because it doesn't say you have to have all 3 represented.
No, it says
So are we changing it from a minimum of 3
to a 2 unit.
units to 2?
I mean, essentially with that or, it does appear that changes it to a 2 unit pad. As long as you provide a combination, you couldn't do a studio and a studio. You would have to have a combination of the different types of units, but.
Is there a consensus around any particular
I would like to allow any kind of mixture. If somebody wanted to do 6 studios, I'd be fine with that. What would be the problem?
I'm going to start to get the assured housing confused with the pad, but
Just think of them as the same thing.
We're on, so
well,
page 32 of the 61.
yeah,
or-
no, but because we originally talked about the pad as being 80% affordable, and so
Right.
Yeah, if you had 2,
And-
how could you do that?
so you lose that affordability when you go below 5 units. Like if you have 5, you have 1 market rate and truly 80% are affordable, but anything less than 5, you're basically offering anywhere you could just be at 50 to 75%.
Well, that's why Chris put this chart in, so it's A, so that's why I was saying the page. So it's, if you want to do it by number, it's 17.68.030. Oh, no, 17.68.050A. Or if you're looking online, it's page 32. And it's the affordability concept, and then there's a chart. So if you're doing 2 to 4 units as a pad, one's got to be market. So if you're doing 2, one is market, one is not.
Yeah, but my point is, from the beginning with the pad, we said that it would be providing 80% affordable housing. So if you're doing a 2-unit, you're effectively only providing 50%. So, I mean, that does change things for me, what we've been saying from the beginning.
I agree with Rodney. I think we see a profusion of 2 projects with 2 units on them, one of them market rate and the other one affordable.
So if you want to stick with an 80% requirement, you want to stick with an 80% requirement if that's your direction.
I think that was the goal, wasn't it?
But that means for smaller developments.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I'm hoping this can be used for is some redevelopment of existing redevelopment.
Yeah, so go
on
from one
lots
house
which
to
are
one.
small enough that perhaps, I mean, for existing lots, 2 to 4 units may be what's achievable, and I wouldn't want to discourage that, because it might be someone who's lived here for 20 years and retiring, and they want to help out the housing situation and have some income from it.
Or a house that's dilapidated could be torn down, and then the
exactly.
fourplex could go in its place.
Yes, exactly.
And then in this chart, if you do 4 units, 1 would be market, 3 would not be. 3 would be required to be affordable. So I think it's, I hear what you're saying, it's not at the 80%, but I think it still achieves the goal of requiring, if you get density, requiring the additional units to be affordable. Does that make sense? So
Yeah, but I'm just, it is a concern if you are only gonna build 2 units and one's affordable and the other is.
That's still 50%,
Yeah,
which is actually really great.
If all
So
you've
you
got
build
room
a-
for is 2
So you build a
units.
studio, 140 unit, and then you build a 3-bedroom and you sell it for, and that's your market rate. How are we gonna decide which one is market rate and which one's the affordable housing?
That's always specified in the affordability concept that, I mean, when the plan is submitted for review by planning staff, you're going to designate which unit is the market rate unit and which one is not.
honestly, that's creating an affordable unit.
But I think that is a nuance that
Sell
could
the
be
big one for market, the affordable, the littler one for affordable, who cares?
And is it worth noting, make sure I understand this correctly, that ultimately, the way it's written now, the council will have the discretion to approve it or not.
That's right.
At the end of the day.
That's right.
So my understanding is that the whole reason for getting rid of conditional use permits was not so much the conditional use process as the subjectivity that was embedded in how it's written. And so now you're saying that we can use subjectivity to deny applications.
Because it's a bonus density. It's not a.
It's not by right.
That's right. It's not a use by right.
Okay.
It's a P.
Thank you.
It's like a PUD, but a PAD.
As much as possible, I've been trying to come up with bright line rules in this ordinance. And if you say it's an absolute 80% affordable requirement, then that's what it'll be. Just the consequence of that might rule out some smaller projects. If you want, if you like the chart as is, that's fine too. Just understand that it means less than 80% in the case of those very, very small developments. And those, you're right, those are likely to happen. You got a small lot that is not optimized. Somebody could build on that and generate a couple units that way.
Well, how about as a compromise that for the existing chart for the 2 to 1 market rate unit for 2 to 4, that there is some more specificity about some parity between the 2 units.
How about 3 to 4 or just 4?
Well, just that they're not less than such percentage smaller than the market rate unit.
Let's do the example. So somebody takes their existing lot with a house and they tear the house down.
Let's talk about R2. Let's do this. Let's have this example in R2.
Okay.
Okay.
So in R2, you can only, then you tear it down and then you build a big house and then an apartment complex of like a triplex.
Okay, red on Tusher. That's what we're gonna do.
Right.
I'm just
I can't
saying,
even-
let's have the, I mean,
Yeah, let's do it.
yeah,
Okay.
let's do it.
So in Tusher, on Tusher, somebody tears a house down.
Mhm.
And then, how big is a lot on Tusher? 0.1 acres?
Yes.
Okay. So you could build with the 7-foot setbacks, plus, what could you build? You could go,
I
you could
sketched
do
this
a,
out in Steenville.
you did?
I did.
Let's see it.
I don't, talk about something else for a minute. Or
Okay.
you had,
No,
you
those are
you
large
guys
Because I
had the
think what you
email.
could
large.
get is a 2-story,
You had this on your.
well, and I was gonna suggest
I'll see
taking
if
off a couple
I may
feet
or may
for
not
the
have it in
height
my
of
email.
structures, but as it is right now, you could do
What?
like a 3-story,
I don't-
but it would be all attached, like it would be an apartment.
Yes.
And it would be like, you could
Email it to me.
maybe do like a 4-plex.
Okay.
You could replace a single family with like a 4-plex, but right now, that would require 6 parking spots. So I don't think a 4-plex would fit on Tusher with the setbacks and the parking.
Fourplex would not?
Not on Tusher, I don't think so.
This is,
Would it? If you justified it all the way to the back, and you had your parking in the front, and you had to do 6 parking spots, and the units were at least,
At 140
What if they're all,
square feet
yeah,
And then you're
maximum, I mean,
and then you're talking it's an apartment, it's not like a single family, or like, you can't sell off pieces of it. Like, one person would own the whole thing.
right. So 140 if we had,
So there's no selling one and then keeping,
we did 4 little,
but if you did four,
4 little studios of 140 square feet.
or even,
you could do 4 studios, that would be 4 parking spots to replace one house. And you'd have couples and singles.
I mean, can we, like, what, it'd be really nice to have I'm visual, so to have a concrete example. So if that is it, is it 4 or is it potentially be 5 or 6? I mean, these are the realities that people, I think, really need to know because it's complex language and people are already confused with the household and family, so.
So if you had 5, you would be required to have 5 parking spots and if the 5 units had 2 bedrooms, then you would be required to have 8 parking spots, right? And they would be off-street, so they'd be on the property. And you would have to have, like, a curb cut and be able to, like, get in and out of each of those parking spots. So the parking lot for a 4-unit with 2 bedrooms in each would be probably prohibitive in the Tusher neighborhood.
if you can stack the parking front and back, then
Which you can.
which makes it more feasible to divide up an existing lot into 4. Actually, what I ran into was that it's probably going to eat away at the on-street parking because of the driveways. Which curb cuts, yeah.
You are limited in size on that, width of that curb cut though.
Right, and also the interpretation of like the mandatory landscaping.
Which is only 5%.
No, the mandatory that's in a different part of the code, which is 70% of
70%
of
of the
the
front
required
side.
setback. But some of it can be, it doesn't all have to be plants, so.
5% is the open space.
Oh, okay.
I mean, you said Tusher, and Tusher has really small lots. So like,
Well,
Well,
these are the realities, that we need to look at, because at this point, we can have a 3-story complex
Apartment,
yes, on Tusher.
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So here's something that's interesting, the Purple Sage,
Yes.
which is now a nightly rental.
Mhm.
That's an 8-unit, and each unit has 1 bedroom. But it's an 8-unit, and it's a relatively small lot with green space in the front. I'm pretty sure the parking is, it's commercial in the pad, there would be more required parking. So it'd need to be a larger lot. So that's some perspective of like 8 units with 1 bedroom. And if you look at the aerial, you can compare that size lot with other lots, but you'd have to add parking. The pad would require more parking than the Purple Sage has.
Question for you. So, we've talked about in single-family dwellings, the standard is 2 parking spaces per dwelling. But here you've said that the Planning Commission recommended reducing that to 1 space per unit for pads.
That's right.
Okay, so if in your hypothetical example here, suppose we had 4 units on Tusher, under the Planning Commission's recommendation, they'd only be required to have 4 off-street parking spaces. And my anticipation is that some fraction, we'll see families moving in there, but we'll see boarding house, if you will, use as well. And I'm anticipating pushback from the neighborhoods, particularly in R2, that there'll be cars swamping their streets.
That's in 05.
So let's look at H, because that's what you're referring to, parking. So it's 1 off-street parking per studio or single bedroom unit. Units having 2 or more bedrooms shall have parking not less than 1.5 spaces.
But the proposal is to
bedroom.
reduce it to 1, right?
The proposal is for it to be
Reduce it
1
to
parking
1.
space per unit. That the required parking starts to eat up valuable space for units.
Let's be clear, bedroom being a unit in that
Yes, I'm looking right here.
or bedroom being, so the dwelling.
Oh,
Dwelling
I see.
unit.
Okay, so 1 per dwelling unit
Yes.
like it is.
So 2
Yes.
bedroom,
Currently.
4 plus 1,
Yes.
1 car.
The way that the pad is written now is
It's
that it talks about bedrooms.
Much higher requirement,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we kind of applied this standard. Are you okay if I use that as an example? We applied that standard to the Walnut Lane property, and it significantly increased the number of parking spaces to where we may end up losing units. Yeah,
Stacking higher, yeah.
if we impose the 1.5 spaces per 2 and or multiple bedroom. So Tracy did have someone take a look at that and those requirements, which is why we're making the recommendation that it be 1 space per unit.
Dwelling unit.
unit.
So be it a 2-bedroom or 3-bedroom or a studio.
The way it is currently, basically.
1 space per unit or 1 space
Dwelling
per
unit.
bedroom?
Dwelling unit.
What
Dwelling
if a
unit
dwelling
being
unit
a
had 4?
dwelling unit,
Just
Well,
like it is
I don't-
now.
right.
I'm not sure that the people who would qualify for a pad unit will have 4 vehicles or a bunch of toys either. So I think that needs to be kept in mind too, as well.
We can't.
Because we're talking about actual limits on, deed restrictions and how much they can make and everything in here as well. Unlike the boarding houses or bunk houses, as you call them. That's
And I'm sorry.
a different situation.
And to be clear, 1 family dwelling, or as it's defined it's set in our code right now, requires 2 spaces.
That's
right.
right.
Correct.
Okay, right.
And just not to muddy the waters here, but the pad standards are intended to be sort of a standalone standard to supersede any conflicting provisions in the code, so that this is a sort of a special flavor of development that has a specific requirement that differs from everything else. It's important that we try to be as clear as possible about that, and I think we are.
And these are, it is a trade-off. For the increased density, they are deed restricting these units. They are subject to those affordability controls. So it's not the same as a single household dwelling that can be sold and rented, or, it follows some different guidelines to keep it in that affordable level.
Well, the pad could be either rentals or
ownership.
ownership.
Mhm.
I liked the parking requirements as they were.
Which is 1.5 per,
One per bedroom, and then 1.5.
It's one for a single bedroom, and then if there's more than one bedroom, it's
more than one would be a half, yeah. So like a 3-bedroom would just be 2 required parking spots.
So it'd be, so if, as it reads right now, if it was like a 3-bedroom,
You would have 1.5 spaces.
1.5 spaces.
However, in the code, it does talk about for fractional spaces, you round down.
No, if it's a 3-bedroom, it's, you have to have 5, isn't that right?
No, you have one.
Units having 2 or more bedrooms shall have parking of not less than 1.5
1.5
spaces per bedroom. So if you have a 3-bedroom,
That's
it's
4.5.
1.5 spaces per bedroom.
Yes.
Plus
So
1,
that's
5.5.
4.5.
4.5, which is 5, right. So
But you
that's
round down.
5.
But you round down, so
You
it's
round
4.
down
Okay.
according to our code.
Got it.
And
Tell us what you want. That's the thing,
Yep.
is to decide, if it's 1 per bedroom or, since time is short and we need to try to move ahead with drafting and getting this finalized, is there a consensus building around something less than?
I like the parking
written.
as it's written in the draft with the 1 and then the 1.5.
Madam Mayor, if I may add, we focused on the external effects of this in the neighborhoods, and if you require more off-street parking, then we're going to get less pushback from the neighbors, that's for sure. And it makes me more amenable to maybe leaving it in all the residential zones. If it looks to me like it's a major impact to the neighbors, I might be reluctant to apply it to all the residential zones. R2 and R3 are the obvious ones that the other zones I don't have a problem with, but R2 and R3 are a little dicier because people expect their less dense neighborhoods. So
And the units that we're replacing it with.
R3 is a
It's a
multifamily
it's one of our
residential
more
zone,
dense
so it
zones.
should be a denser zone.
Yeah. R3 and R4 are our most dense zones.
isn't there a difference? So doesn't R3 have apartments and R4 has mobile homes? That's a major
They
difference.
both have apartments.
Yeah.
They both
have
allow for
apartments.
multifamily dwellings. R3 and R4 are denser zones.
Okay. Well, my argument still stands, at least to R2 then, that's for sure.
It's a recommendation. The council has the prerogative to decide what they want that to look like.
If I may, at the end of the day, allowing this is going to have an impact on neighborhoods. There's no way around it. There's simply no way to regulate to a point where allowing additional density in neighborhoods is not going to have some kind of impact. You all have to simply decide if you're willing to have that trade-off, and we do what we can to mitigate it. But at the end of the day, will there be more people parked on a street in front of other people's houses? Probably. Will we have additional enforcement challenges? Most likely. But that is part of the trade-off of what you all are hoping to achieve, which is to have more workforce housing available in the city and not out in, San Juan County, frankly. And so your job is to find that balance, but you can't pretend that there won't be impacts.
I like the way that it's written, because even if you have a 3-bedroom, that doesn't mean that people will have 4 cars. If you have a family that lives in a 3-bedroom
You may or may not.
unit, they might only have 1 car.
How does the rest of the council feel about parking so we can move forward? Do we want to keep it as is, or do we want to go with the staff recommendation of reducing parking requirements?
Keep it.
Keep it.
Keep it.
Okay. Well, then let's move on. Can we talk about height?
Yes, please.
Okay, so something was said during our joint meeting where somebody could do 3, and we were all kind of like, ugh, 3 seems high, specifically in R2, right? So I propose that we reduce the height in R2, maybe R3 and R4, to 27. And then C1, C2, C4, C5 to 36. And my thinking behind that is that we go with average height, right? So that would essentially, if somebody wanted to do a 3-story in the R2, R3, or R4, they'd have to push it down. They'd have to go down into the ground with that height restriction. So, and then there's still, like, the more units, the more parking, like, it's gonna be complicated. It just minimizes the impact while still providing, you know, the opportunity for creative density.
So can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
So right now, if someone were to build multifamily housing in the R3, they would be allowed to build at 30 feet. And so, but under a pad, you would only be allowed to build to 27?
Yeah.
You also have
No,
to.
no.
In the R3?
Oh, I see what you're saying. So maybe my height thing is only in R2.
Well, I think that, I mean, this was pointed out that
You're right. That's a good point.
any building can be built to that height in that zone, but also, as we've talked about, because of the parking requirements, there's going to be a need to use ground floor space for parking, which will tend to push buildings up.
Exactly.
And so I think a pad may be more likely to have a tall building right on the setback line. I wonder if we're concerned about height, if we should address that generically in the zones.
I agree,
as opposed to in the pad. I've also wondered about, this is going to probably need a drawing, but tapered setbacks. So you push tall buildings, like you can still have a tall building, but push it closer to the middle of the lot, so it's less of an impact. And I realize when I proposed this at the county, it seemed like some of the staff there thought that it was too complicated for some of their applicants, but it doesn't seem too complicated to me.
Jeff, you've got
Here's an example of what Kaylin's talking about. Does not have a building in that, but that's what we'd be looking at is taller it got, the further into the interior of the lot it would be. I think there's a second one here too. Let me see. Yeah.
And any architect could read this requirement and draw to that. It would be the responsibility of the developer to fit the unit in the tent.
So I'd like to emphasize that the complaints I've heard from multiple sources, what they object to when it gets to 3 stories is people living up on the top floor with windows facing an adjacent lot looking into single-family homes, so people don't have any privacy in their backyards. And I agree this is a trade-off with density and so forth, but particularly in the R2 zones, you know, where people treasure that.
I think you could also go down Mountain View Drive and look up at Dock Allen. The topography alone will determine that also. And it wouldn't even have to be a 3-story house. It could be a 2-story house.
Oh, well, and we have that in Tasher Walker.
You bet, yeah.
But
You know,
again, I go back
grades.
to a single-family residence could be built to the same standard, and it doesn't have to be under the pad. It could just be a home, and it would still have that same issue.
Typically, it isn't, though. I mean, until you get to multifamily apartments.
But if I built a 3-story home next to your single-story home, I'm still looking into your house.
Which is why I wonder if if we want to try to protect neighborhood character via this method, if we just use it universally in the setbacks as opposed to making it pad specific.
What would you change it to?
Some version of the pyramid.
So instead of having height.
Well, I would think there would still be an absolute height limit, but then some form of the pyramid to not, I mean, maybe it would effectively be a pyramid with the top capped if the lot were big enough.
Is that something that staff could do as a draft for us for this?
You bet.
Not in this timeframe?
I mean,
That's a
yeah, I'm not
Well,
anticipating.
it would, if it were in the setbacks, in the general zone setbacks, then it would be separate from the pad. And so hence it wouldn't be, passing pad wouldn't be contingent on modifying how we deal with setbacks generally.
So what would we do for like the height and setbacks in the pad? Because right now it like lists numbers.
Well, I
Are
wonder.
you good with the height of 30 and 40, but then you apply the pyramid and then that restricts it? Is that what you're saying?
No, what I'm saying is that, well, actually, what I think we should do is just apply the underlying zone height limits. I don't know that we even need to say anything other than underlying zone height limits apply.
Aren't they pretty close? What's the existing underlying zone? Like in the C.
30 and 40.
Yeah.
So we didn't even change that.
And then come back and refine it with the pyramid.
Well,
I
then
think
come
that's
back and
good.
refine
That's a
the
good
general,
suggestion.
the setbacks generally outside of pad, well, for whatever zones that we deem appropriate, yeah.
So then for C and D, we would just say follows underlying zones.
There you go.
Sorry, we're like at 17.68.050, performance standards. C and D. Height of structures is C, and then D is setbacks, adjacent solar access. So you're saying, let's just say that for those two, they to comply with the underlying code, and then staff can come to us with the tent ordinance.
Not allowing camping.
To be confused
Tent
with
ordinance.
glamping.
Does that automatically address solar access? Because one of my questions when I read this was, who actually then goes through and determines the distance of these solar setbacks?
It would be decided by whoever the land use authority is for a given type of application. So at preliminary plan, that'd be planning commission.
And the tent could potentially address the solar setbacks in most instances if we chose to do so.
You're absolutely right. In fact, those were generated for exposure planning for the sun exposure.
Okay, so does the council, do we have a consensus that C and D can follow the, yeah? Okay, yes.
Can I add one more?
Consensus of what?
So that we are going to, in lieu of height and setbacks, C and D, we're just gonna say follows the underlying zone requirements for height and setbacks as regular city code.
Okay.
And then we're gonna get the tent to the planning commission as soon as possible.
I have this slight fear that the tent will take, we don't know how long future code amendments will take, so I wonder if we could just leave D in as a safe stopgap, pending tent, and then plan on take it out once the tent gets passed. Is that feasible?
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally.
Okay. And one more comment on C.
Does that make sense? Okay.
There's this other sentence, building height shall be measured from the average finished grade of the building to the midpoint of the highest peak of the roof. And so last I checked, there were a few different ways of measuring building height in the code, which I would hope that we would address and remove any inconsistencies code-wide. Maybe we need to have this in so that until that happens, but I think it's important that the council understands that this can mean that a building, like the peak of a building can be taller than 30 or 40 feet.
Right.
Because it's the midpoint of the, measured from the midpoint of the highest peak of the, this is actually.
No, so if it's a pitched roof, it'd be like sort of.
Well, it's the midpoint of the highest roof plane, actually.
Right.
So this is not the definition I would prefer. And I'd really like this cleaned up in the code.
So Caitlin, are you
Which
suggesting that?
I think that's what we're suggesting with the tent.
What the tent, it could be part of the
This is
tent,
a
It would definitely be part of the tent because it's height.
the tent initiative.
Yes.
There's an entire code reorganization that is slated to come after some of these other things, and that's where that is cleaned up.
Okay.
It would be good to do the tent sooner than later.
It's the tent initiative.
Yes.
We can keep
there's
that
yeah.
And Jeff's saying it's reasonable. so
Well,
it's
that's
okay.
because Jeff's being nice, but I'm going to tell you that we have, it's November and December is close, and there's a lot that's in the docket and in line already, and I just struggle sometimes with the infusion of priorities without going through a more deliberative prioritizing process, which you all will go through in January. So can we just have that be one of the things that we put in the list of things we know you want to make sure you prioritize in some way with all the other things that are priorities?
And then keep this in.
Yeah.
Can I just ask you, Kaylin, though,
Priority list on one screen and the working code that we're talking about.
Absolutely.
Kaylin, I'm just checking, because we started on the council at the same time, and we've been following this issue of 3 different height definitions. So what would you prefer?
What would I, as far as a definition?
Since you mentioned that that's not the one that you would.
Oh, well, I think that it's just, this one is just ambiguous because I think it's actually the midpoint of the highest roof plane is actually what the building code uses, which I think this is referencing. But I think we should have a discussion about it.
I think we should.
I think that's clearer. I like that. I'll make that change.
For this.
Midpoint of the highest roof plane. I got it.
Okay, the way I read it, it's underlying setbacks is all you care about, and if you set the 45-degree angles, everything else is determined. There is no height restriction. It's all basically governed by the setbacks and the 45-degree angle.
Well, I think there should be an absolute height limit as well, so that we don't end up with
Let's talk about it.
lots potentially. But I think that should be debated at a future, I think this is a way forward to address our concerns about this without bogging down the pad.
It's going to make it more expensive, I can tell you that. I mean, a builder, instead of building 2 stories straight up or whatever it's going to be, now he's got to go.
No, it's just called a pitch. All right.
Can we go back to the agenda summary and the 4 points that the Planning Commission had wanted to address? So the first one was limiting the profit on any pad. I didn't know if that had been addressed through the, I'm sure it's, I
I'd like
can't
to not
remember the
address
names
that.
of my sections. What's
I
that?
don't think it's going to be an issue. I don't think we need to address it.
I agree.
I think
As
it's
it-
going to be a struggle to reach the 80%
Agreed.
in general. And if someone manages to make a little bit of extra profit, more power to them. We can use them as a model for other developments.
Talking about the affordability concept? Back to that table again? Is that what we're
I'm talking about the Planning Commission had this concern about developers profiting too much from pads, and that's kind of inconceivable to me.
I agree. I agree with you, Kaylin. I really respect that they said that, but that is not my concern at all.
And then the second one was, what's the appropriate size for a dwelling, possibly enacting minimums for the area of each unit type or base the number of occupants on the area of the unit. So do we feel like we've addressed that?
That's really the occupancy conversation.
That's the
right?
occupancy conversation, yeah.
Okay, and in terms of appropriate size for a dwelling, we decided to go with code, right?
Building code.
Minimum, yeah.
And then minimum square feet of each dwelling for financing purposes.
Oh, yeah, if you can find financing to finance a 1-bedroom, great. I don't think we need to dictate that you can't build a 1-bedroom because you may or may not get financing for it.
There was some discussion at the Planning Commission level that lenders typically don't lend on something that's under a certain square footage, but there was some other conversations that occurred that if the market is out there for that lending to happen, it could possibly happen. And not everyone may go through a conventional lender. They may have something else. And so,
That's for subdivision units.
That was, yes, but even, I mean, I don't know if it would apply to a
300 square foot.
an apartment building and the number of units in there. I didn't think it would apply to that, but yes, it was more toward the subdivision requirements that lenders may or may not lend on something that's under 300 square feet, but if there's a market demand for it, they may, I don't know. But not everybody may look at conventional financing for it either, and.
I see that most of your initial, assuming you enact your pad, most of what you're going to see is rental units, apartment type units for rent. And if they're lawfully developed and they pencil out, the developer is going to be able to get financing. The developer will get financing. The issue of sellable units is really, again, also depends on the market, but I'm less worried about that. I mean, if they've got a product that meets code and is lawful and it's approved, and people want it, lenders will lend.
If a one-bedroom house came on the market for $100,000, who wouldn't buy it in this room? And they'd figure out a way to get a loan.
Right.
So it's not a problem.
I vote for keeping it in.
I think the last one was lockable storage, which it looks like it got added in. I think one of my questions, which you answered, Chris, was I wasn't sure if the unit is larger, does it get lockable storage, or is it just
that was
what
the
determines that?
initial draft said. I think it's been changed. So again, we've allowed for a lot of flexibility. I think you might want to go to something that just says that you'll have lockable storage for each unit, that it is sufficient for storing a bicycle or an adult bicycle, and that it should be bigger if the unit is bigger, maybe without getting into how many square feet. I don't know.
I think that's reasonable. What do you think, Ronnie?
It's fine with me. I'm just looking through these to make sure that we address them. And then the other issue that I got confused about, as to whether we addressed it, was this whole question of when the start date for the 50-year affordability.
Yeah, it's tied to the certificate of occupancy in the draft. So that's the latest point that I could see it applying 50 years from that date. And I can find you I'll cite to you where it is in the ordinance. The LURA attaches as of. If you guys want to move on, I'll come back to it.
Well, I support that being certificate of occupancy.
Yeah, it's section 130A2.
Because otherwise we were talking about it being attached to the point at which you get the pad awarded.
Right,
and there could be a development time gap or a sit on it gap. And you could wait it out. So at C of O, that triggers the start of the affordability.
And that would be for each phase, if somebody's doing 4 phases, let's say?
We'll have to, that's going to have to be, one thing I'll tell you is.
That's a good point.
You got to build some flexibility in here. We're not going to be able to, in our code, anticipate every project that comes along. I can anticipate situations where we might have multiple LURAs, one LURA for phase 1, second one for phase 2 because it's 2 years later, that sort of thing. The intent is that they run for 50 years and that they go from the date of certificate of occupancy as written.
Well, that would cover, like if there were phased, you get your C of O, when your phase is complete, then you can give C of O to what was completed in the phase. So actually that does cover what you're asking, doing it at the C of O, Chris. Yeah. Yeah. I have one more thing. It's kind of big, but it's not really all that big. So in 17.68.070, submittal requirements, there's a list of submittal requirements that were giving me heartburn because a lot of them were appropriate for larger scale development. And it felt to me like it was asking a lot if somebody just wanted to go 4-plex. So in conversation with Summer, we said we could, for A, which is several pages of submittal requirements, so it'd be A, B, and C. It actually matches subdivision code,
Site plan
code 17.67.040. I know, it's so much like weird numbers. But basically, taking that and instead of outlining it there, because there might be changes to the submittal requirements, matching it to code and
Referring back to the site plan
referring
regulations.
to this, yeah, referring to site plan regs instead of outlining them here. And it's just A, B, and C. Because it's like, it requires a traffic study. Well, you don't need a traffic study for a fourplex.
Not in every case.
But the key is that then subsequently what must also happen is to bring forth that different threshold at which the site plan process kicks in, which we do have teed up for you.
Yeah.
I mean, just to kind of give you some background on why this discussion came up is we have an application for a fourplex. And right now, the current requirement is that for anything over a duplex, they're required to go through the site plan submittal process. And there are significant costs and, I mean, there really are some significant costs with the submittal documents that are required for a site plan that are barriers to getting affordable housing units. So the exemptions, right now the exemptions apply to single family or two family dwellings. This would apply to up to and including 6, would not have to follow the site plan. They would not have to submit those significant documents with the site plan. They could go to a building permit and it would be reviewed by the development review team, which is consistent with what we're doing with the smaller units, but that way it would allow for multi-unit housing to be developed without that added cost.
Is that all right with everybody?
So basically, including like removing A, B, and C and including a reference to the relevant code sections?
Yes.
Yes, I would much prefer that.
It reduces the size of our code.
Yes.
It makes me nervous, but I'm not a developer.
It doesn't
so.
reduce the complexity of a submittal
Right.
unless you change your site plan rules at the same time. I mean, it's just saying you're going to refer to another place in the code for the submittal requirements. These duplicate what's in the code for site plan, and it was again trying to have a standalone document, but we can take that out.
And that's just for 6 or less units.
Well, right now it's for 2. So if you were to do a duplex pad, then you would have to do a parking
Right,
traffic
no,
study.
but
But
we're
we're
going to
get an
But where we
ordinance
refer to
in
this other
December.
section, yeah.
Like next month, we're gonna get
Yes.
it. That will expand it to
Yes.
6,
Yes.
which is reasonable.
It's been in the works for a little bit.
Needs to happen.
So is that good consensus? That's okay? Okay. What else? Because we're at 7:45, and this could be a good time to move right along, unless there's any other concerns about the pad.
I have a bunch of questions, so I don't know, how do you guys want this addressed? Are we gonna spend the time, or are we gonna email them in, or what?
Are they in addition to the questions you sent earlier today?
I have a number of possible questions, edits, and I haven't high-graded them to must addressed or I could live with having them unanswered. So I'm just having a general process question. I think Jeff mentioned that possibly in his edits in the semi-redline version of the workforce housing, the possibility of just passing some of the definition affordability requirements in the pad independently so that we could move forward with workforce housing?
Well, I think our pad is pretty close, and we're putting it to our November 13th agenda. So I feel like that could still be time where, Ronnie, if you wanted to email questions.
Yes, but just for process for the future for this body, I'd like to make the point that I appreciate the Planning Commission has been spending 5 years on this. We literally as a body I have seen this twice so far. I mean, I've not spent 5 years with it, and I don't think anybody should have to spend 5 years, but literally this is only the 3rd time I'm seeing it, and it's a huge thing for the community. So I do feel like some of the questions are valid, if not just for me, for colleagues or for the public.
I agree. It's brand new to me too.
So we'll still have room for like getting questions answered by staff, posing questions to council, and then deliberation on the 14th. So I hear what you're saying. Like, we've really only just received this from the Planning Commission at our last joint meeting. So I just want to respect what Ronnie is saying in terms of the time for us to review it.
I don't think it's a good process, but I'm just saying that for the future. It's not acceptable for me in the future.
I mean, would you feel more comfortable asking these questions now so that
Sure.
open and for the public to hear?
I'm okay with that. As long as we're okay, because then we're going to be sitting here for a little bit longer. I'm okay with that. I mean, we could spend another 15 minutes.
Well, I would say we can do that. We could also, or in alternate, if there are questions that you have that are written down, we can respond to those, and those can be published in the packet for the public, published earlier than that online. And there's plenty of ways to sort of get those questions out there to the public, presuming anybody wants to hear them. You know, like, we can do it either in this sort of give and take, we can do it in that published sort of way.
Well, we could also recap during deliberation, sort of additional questions that were answered. I'm okay to do another 15 minutes if the council is.
I am too, but I don't think I'm going to get through my questions in 15 minutes. But I'm willing to try to work on it in the interim.
I'm just wondering, what are we doing here? Because we had a discussion about growth prior to the joint city-county meeting where we discussed, if we ever want to talk about maybe reducing the number of hotels or overnight rentals, that's a really big code change and we got to deal with that separately. And to me, this is a really big, equally big change, if not larger. And I am a bit frustrated that it's hard to find the time to spend discussing it when I'm expected to vote on it.
Well, so a couple things. That's why we have this workshop. Or this special meeting, and the pressure is on because of our time period of passing the ordinance.
Yes, but that's all about project planning too.
Yeah.
Well, let's try to maybe work through as many as we can just as in the time that we have, and I'm happy to respond to questions and try to, it's up to you guys, but
let's just work through this. We're all together. Let's work through it.
So looking at zones, obviously the RA1 and R1 aren't part of the PAD, and the C3 neither. I was just curious, did anyone discuss the pros or cons of including the C3? I know by nature it's different, and C5 is a bit different too, but.
Well, the idea behind the C3 is that it is your central commercial area. That's where your sales tax revenue is generated. Typically, housing does not generate an income for the city, and so it's still, I mean, we still allow housing above the ground floor. There's still the employee housing, but as far as that C3 area and preserving that for your income-based properties, that's why it was not included in that zone.
Could someone who owns one of those properties do a pad on their upper level?
They could certainly provide housing above the ground floor already. I mean, there are no limitations on the unit size.
Unrestricted.
Yeah, I mean, so it wouldn't necessarily have to be a pad. It could just be the development of housing above the ground floor, absolutely.
But if they wanted to derive some of the associated benefits, they could.
Because the C3 has very few limitations as far as the commercial development, I mean, you're looking at zero zoning code. I mean, there's no setback. There's no, there are building code setbacks, but no zoning code. Potentially, you could have a number of units as long as they meet the height. I mean, like I said, there's no setbacks. So I don't know if there's much of a benefit to them using the pad in the C3.
Okay, and then are we conceiving of anything different that might happen if you had a pad like down on a dead end or cul-de-sac or a flag lot or something? Does that affect any of the concerns about traffic, or does that change anything?
I think the same concerns would apply whether it's middle of the block or on a cul-de-sac. I think you're going to run into the same. You'll probably run into the same concerns. I raised that in some issues because of the issue we had with the bed and breakfast on the end of the cul-de-sac, and presumably occupancy-wise or whatever. Yeah, okay. Let's see. So Chris, I had sent you some questions about inconsistencies in how we're defining affordable housing. We have one definition in the affordable housing plan that we signed onto with the county, but the one in the pad is different. So is there any reason they can't be consistent? And a big reason for that is because the way we define affordable housing in the plan is that part of your 30% income is not just going to the cost of your purchase or to your rent. It also includes utilities. And the definitions in here don't reflect any of that, and that seems important.
They do reflect that. I mean, I think we're talking about two different things. The one was the income cutoffs for defining moderate, low, very low, and extremely low. And one of the based in part on the input from the mayor on that, we want to make those consistent with the standards that HUD typically adheres to in eligibility standards for affordable housing. So those changes, that will be made in the final document. Then I think you're getting at the question of affordability in terms of initial purchase price or original purchase price. Is that correct?
This has to do with rents too. I mean, when you look at the affordable housing plan, like the definition there says, federal and state policies consider housing to be affordable when housing costs consume no more than 30% of gross annual household income. This standard particularly applies to households earning less than 80% area median income. Rental housing costs include rent, water, gas, and electric payments. Ownership housing includes mortgage, taxes, insurance, water, gas, electric payments, and homeowner association fees. So my question is, if we, through our whole affordable housing plan, are considering that part of your 30% when you determine people's affordability, isn't it important that it's clear in the pad that that's the same definition?
Yes, and the rent calculation, I'm looking at 120B as written. It says the developer offering affordable units for lease shall set the monthly rental rate at an amount, assuming a 3-bedroom unit, and I've got a hypothetical here, that does not exceed 30% of the area median income.
Okay, so you're just assuming utilities are in there and you don't have to say as much.
For the Grand County household of 4, adjusted from time to time, divided by 12 months. And that units with a greater than, that talks about the proportional adjustment for size of unit. So it's just set at 30% of AMI. We could make an adjustment to account for utilities, that sort of thing. I know we made that kind of adjustment when we talk about sales price calculation for sales units. If you've got some specific language, or if you want, is there a specific change you want me to make to that draft language?
What can I add? Determine if someone's reading the document, if they're going to assume when they find out if they qualify for one of these pad units and somebody calculates 30%, is it just going to be, if they go to the affordable housing plan, it's 30%, and the 30% looks at their income and includes their rent and their housing price. Whereas if they go to this document, all of a sudden it's like, oh no, all the rent is going to be, not the rent, the utilities are going to be separate. Because financially that matters for someone.
Yeah, nobody's going to be referring to the affordable housing plan when they go to determine eligibility for an apartment that's developed and offered pursuant to this plan. So the ordinance is going to define the affordability requirements, and if you want me to modify that by reference to taxes, utilities, that sort of thing, tell me what I can add to that definition there that would.
Never
make
mind,
it-
clearly I'm the only one confused. Just as a layperson, it did not seem consistent to me. So I was just trying to make sure they were consistent.
Okay, it may not be consistent, but the question is, what do you want me to change? What can I do to make this more clear?
Well, I'm just wondering why the affordable housing definition is not the same in the affordable housing
Because I
plan
didn't
and the
read
pad.
that document is for, I guess is probably one reason.
Okay, so I guess one of my questions is, are our governing documents supposed and our ordinances supposed to match or not?
No, not necessarily.
Okay.
Tell me what you
Never
want to
mind
change.
then.
I think
It's important.
Can I make a suggestion?
Yes, please.
So the moment that so if somebody wants to be deemed eligible, they're gonna apply.
Right.
So, and then whatever, whoever we designate, whether it's in-house or like if, we have talked about designating the housing authority as a possibility of a partner that would qualify individuals. So so whether it's the housing authority or the city in-house would go through and do the qualification of the buyer or the renter.
Correct.
And so are you saying, and maybe it's helpful to say that in the pad that the approval will be made, that the qualification of the buyer or renter will be done by and I think it says it somewhere, but I don't know where.
Can I maybe clarify Ronnie's question? Because I had the same question, but in the My name is Caitlin Myers. And just to clarify Ronnie's point, when I was reading through, you have the same definition for extremely low and very low income.
Oh, yeah.
And I've already changed that.
Oh, okay. Then that was maybe what I was wondering Ronnie was questioning, but if it's not, then
I think it's part of it, but we've already changed that, like, the income bracket is going to get changed for our final draft.
Okay.
To include extremely, very low, and moderate. Yes.
I think Ronnie's looking for clarification to make sure that all of the other items are included in their cost when their application's considered.
That
We
it's
put
not
that-
just
that-
the
we put that in the
rent.
definition, and I think that's what she's looking for.
That it's not just the rent or the sales price, that it actually includes utilities,
Or your
homeowners
HOA fees,
association
or-
dues,
I mean,
that
if
those
it's
are all
purchased.
considered part of that cost of housing, correct?
And so that would be the responsibility of the agency to pre-qualify or to qualify the borrowers or the renters based on their income and expenses. So where is it in the plan? Where is it? Where is it, Ronnie?
Page 27, 28, is that?
The
Give me a section
definition is
number.
27 and 28.
It's also in the definitions.
So it's the definitions. The
Yeah, subsection, 020 subsection 3, affordable housing, we're adjusting the brackets as discussed. And then in section 120,
So we're adding, so we're.
well, okay, we're talking about two different things here. And just to be clear, Ronnie, I think we were talking about the brackets, the cutoffs for eligibility. And then we're talking about the rent calculation, how we determine that a particular unit is affordable based on area, median income, and not exceeding 30% of the applicant's AMI. Am I correct on that? Can you give me some more direction? Do you want me to say that utilities would be calculated within that definition?
Yes.
All right.
where's that's not,
B, rent calculation, I think.
Yeah, it's section 120B, rent calculation.
I think it would also be included in the
20.
Because they don't
ownership, effect, which is which so would be included with the mortgage payment.
Yeah, that's right.
Typically includes,
Wait, what is section 120?
1768, 120.
Say that again?
1768, 120.
it's part of the dark.
Oh, way over here. Okay.
It's the deep state dark code.
So I guess if I'm understanding, maybe it's best if we take the definition that's in the affordable housing plan, or that
Happy to include it if that would
regulation,
make
and
people
put
more
that
comfortable.
into these sections to be clear that it includes more than just the rent or the payment, that it includes other items. Is that?
Yeah, because when you get to the original purchase price and the section on rent calculation, it also, I mean, but I'm not an attorney, but it's, yeah, like, it would just be confusing to me if I was just a home, yeah, whatever, trying to apply.
Well, and we are going to, whether it's the city or whoever we contract with, they're going to look at this rent calculation and then they're going to apply whether or not people are qualified
That's
based
right.
on it. So
I mean,
add
what you have
utility, yeah.
You've got to set in broad strokes what the eligibility criteria are. I'm trying to make them as clear as I can make them. Not perfect. If there are things that would improve upon that definition, please give me specific guidance.
I think adding utilities and we're good.
All right.
Keep going with the list. This is good work.
So under 17.68.050 affordability concept, A, units developed under this chapter, including affordable and market rate units, shall not be used or offered as overnight accommodations. I'm wondering if this code will be the sole tool with which that's enforced, or if it'll be part of the deed restriction, or
Yes.
part of the development improvements agreements, or
Yes, yes, and yes. I mean,
All of the above.
I think it's expressed elsewhere in the code or in the ordinance to make clear that we're not going to the extra effort to create affordable housing just to have it turned around and utilized as overnight accommodations.
So it'll be part of the deed restriction.
Yes, yeah, the LURA.
What else?
I got some questions from residents on the monitoring, or I guess the enforcement of all of this. Are we planning to do that in-house or out-of-house? Is that something we just determine next and just have to have in place before, the first pad happens?
Yeah, what's going to
We have a reference to a monitoring agency or, monitoring compliance of affordability controls.
I'd say you're correct. We don't know what the answer to that yet. But presuming that we get down the road on this, that'd be something we'd figure out pretty quickly. I mean, we've certainly, like you said, talked about, is there an outside agency that knows how to do this? Do we have in-house expertise now that could do it? At what scale are we talking about? Maybe a scalable thing where we can do it in-house to start, but, with the thousands of pad applications that we're gonna get, we'll need to scale up pretty quick, so.
My suggestion would be, our housing specialist could probably take on the pre-qualification or the qualifying of applicants pretty easily until we hit that certain threshold. But it's worth it to have this conversation with the county at a joint meeting as they're passing ordinance, and we're all gonna be needing a centralized way of qualifying people. And I have made this statement that I believe the Housing Authority to be a really good place to house that work and fund that work collectively from the city and county.
And crossing the county's plans with our own, they're very similar. The one thing that the county doesn't have presently is an income criteria, as we do. But other than that, yeah, I mean, one guy at HASU who knows how to do the county could be an effective person to do it.
We just, you know, we have procurement issues we'd want to make sure we're adhering to, that's all. No.
So,
But we have in-house capacity right now with our housing specialist.
Yes,
Who's
we
shaking
do.
his head, right?
He is, he's looking excited about it.
Wide-eyed.
.050E, open space common facilities, shall comprise not less than 5% of the project R. I think that's area. So.
Did you see that typo, Chris? I saw that.
Yeah, my version doesn't say that, but
Mine doesn't either.
But I'm not concerned about the typo.
Okay.
I'm concerned about the 5% on a small, like, say it's a lot redevelopment with 2 to 5 units, and then you have this common space that a few people have to collectively manage, and then you trigger having to have an HOA, and it's like, why do we impose that overhead on additional governance, self-governance on a few homeowners? So I'm wondering if that's like, if it's ownership, cannot the functionality of that open space be just placed on each individual unit in their lot?
But part of that open space is like bike racks and a covered patio, and, I mean, it's like, it's not.
And if it's owned, it can be with each individual unit.
Would that count as the 5% then?
No, I'm saying, why have it, but when you have common space, then you have to have some way of governing it and maintaining it.
I thought you were gonna say get rid of E.
Well, maybe.
You were?
For 5%, it's a joke.
Yeah, I'd say drop it.
I mean,
Well, here's what we have now, if you look at your screen, I think it's up there. So the reason we went to 5% is because right now, multifamily housing with 9 or more dwellings, 25% of the property has to be a recreation play or landscaped area. If it's less than, or 8 or less, then it's 15%. Over on Cane Creek, as you drive by the last set of apartments, there's that big open space right there. It's almost an acre. And they built under this 25% of the property being open space. So this was an attempt to try to get rid of that. You can't even include currently parking, driveways, dwellings, and required setbacks. And setbacks historically are some form of open space. So at least we allow the setbacks to count towards that 5%. It is very minimal, but it doesn't do away with it completely.
Is there a reason why you didn't want to do away with it completely?
My expectation is,
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, my expectation will be that for a particular project, the developer will end up with a piece of the project that he can't do anything else with, and he'll call that open space for the enjoyment of the tenants. You know?
Right. So in past discussions, and not just, I mean, I'm talking 9 years ago, 10 years ago, we've had people at council meetings start screaming that, quote, those people deserve the same as anybody else. And so we've tried to manipulate various options. So like if you live within X amount of feet of the parkway, or you live within 300 feet of a school playground or soccer field or something, then you did not have to apply that. I'm just going to tell you that all went down in flames.
Mm-hmm.
So we were trying to actually leave a little bit of open space in here as a rebuttal for that.
I would say we have a lot of parks.
well, I don't think 5% is going to.
We need to be respectful when people make comments in this chamber.
Well, if I'm understanding correctly, Kaylin, your concern is more of who's going to manage it. So if you're requiring this 5% to be some sort of common open space, and you have a small development and it's a 2-unit pad, and you and I are now responsible for maintaining a common open space where it makes more sense for me to maintain my side, you to maintain your side, kind of sort of,
Why not just allocate it to the 2 sides? And I mean, they can each have their own bike rack and storage space
And I think
unit
that
that
we
they
can-
own.
I think
And
that
that
we
probably
can
makes the
certainly do
most
that.
sense in pad developments that are subdivided, where you're gonna have separate ownerships. If you have a pad rental, it
Yeah.
makes less sense. But we could put in language that says, you know, the 5% requirement may be waived in pad subdivision projects. The one thought I had, the other thought that went into this was that given that you're already planning for very dense development, you know, small units, from a livability standpoint, at least having some, you know, maybe an outside bench or, you know, picnic tables or, you know, a pergola or whatever, that those kinds of features might make it a little nicer. It's up to you.
So you're just saying 5%, so projects shall include 5% instead of the project area, 5% of each lot?
Well, then that wouldn't be common facilities. So I guess what I'm struggling with is that in some cases, it may be superfluous.
And what I think you're saying is that if you did a pad subdivision where everybody's gonna have their own little separate lot, that you could waive the 5% requirement and give everybody a slightly bigger space.
Yeah.
Okay. If that's what the council wants, that's a fairly easy change.
So are you saying eliminate E?
Well,
Only for subdivisions, pad
Subdivisions.
subdivisions.
Not
Remember that
for,
we've got two types of developments here. We've got pad subdivisions, which contemplate that
Oh,
people
and then you have apartment complex.
And
You're
then you have an
saying
apartment
Subdivision, remove, exclude the open space.
But will that also give somebody the opportunity to not offer a covered, like if you're the builder, to do the covered patio or to offer a small space? I mean, because you'd be like, oh, I don't have the requirement, so I'm just not gonna do it. Because if someone didn't have to do it, they're not going to. So,
Right, so I wonder, I mean, there are other minimum things that they have to include. I mean, so it's like storage and bike parking, I guess those are the same now, are required. So whether they happen in common space or on an individual lot, if it's a subdivision, will still be there. I wonder if units in a subdivision are below a minimum size, if that would trigger a requirement for some common space. Like if you have tiny homes, maybe it is more relevant to have some shared outdoor space as opposed to just totally packing things in.
And keep in mind that essentially what you've got is very, very dense, small minimum unit sizes for both subdivision or apartments. So that may influence how you go in terms of open space.
Right. But I can imagine that units being efficient in size, but still like 500 to 800 square feet, just because the parking limitations will limit what can be developed, and then people might tend to develop things that are a little bit more conventional because they're less faddish.
Okay, we gotta move on to this next item. So I don't know where we just settled there, but I'd like to settle it so we can move on.
Well, let me ask this question. Would it be okay if we keep the 5% requirement for pad apartment developments, rental developments, but waive that requirement for pad subdivisions where
Yes.
each okay,
Yes.
Because individual property owners will be responsible.
for their own
Let's
lot?
let everybody.
That's okay. I'm also cool with deleting the 5%.
Yeah.
Totally.
Okay.
I'm fine with what Chris said. I
Okay.
don't want to delete it.
But waive for subdivisions.
Okay,
I'll make
so,
that change.
okay. Anything else in the pad for discussion? And reminder
And if
that
you've got other
we can,
comments, yeah.
well, reminder that we can still submit comments, that we're still going to have deliberation prior to a vote on November 13th.
is this in a Google Doc format where they could, no?
All right, no, not at this point, but I do like the idea. I mean, Ronnie sent a bunch of questions. If there are other questions, we can put them all on one sort of paper of questions and answer them all in line, so they're all there, kind of like our own go as you, pay as you go FAQ type thing, you know? I think that'd be helpful. And again, happy to publish that if you all want. We can certainly make that public.
Yeah,
Fine.
okay. Well, then we're moving on.
Okay.
And I just want to say, really good work. So, proposed ordinance 2018-20, assured workforce housing policy. We led into the pad with some presentation stuff. So are we going to do the same for the assured workforce housing policy? Okay. And as we're shuffling through our documents, it is found on the page that is 48 online. Otherwise, it's toward the back of our packet.
How does that start the question? When did we change the name? When did that happen?
That was.
That's a good question.
Yeah, it is a good question.
Ordinance rebranding effort.
Yeah. I think we were, go ahead.
I was gonna say, I think it was done in response to, there was I think that framing it in terms of workforce housing as opposed to, is a more specific way of talking about what the goal of the ordinance is, as opposed to, we're not assuring that there's gonna be housing just willy-nilly, trying to say that this is focused on providing for workforce housing specifically.
Gotcha.
We're assuring workforce housing.
Yes,
I like the change in name. It's less confusing now.
Yeah.
except for,
Except for
it
that
made
we-
it more confusing.
Right,
What are we talking about now?
And that was, yeah.
So, Madam Mayor, if I may ask Chris a question. Chris, the last time we saw this ordinance quite a while ago, I thought it was directed towards courtesy of the Nexus study exclusively to hotels.
Right.
And now apparently it's been broadened to other sources, overnight rentals
Oh,
and so
we're gonna
forth.
get into that. I know what you're asking. Let's get into the presentation with Jeff, because he's gonna answer that question for you. And then that's gonna go into our discussion.
Okay.
Thank you for bringing that up.
Okay. So I'm uncertain as to how in-depth you want to go into this. We can talk a little bit about the features that are in the assured workforce housing
Well, let me
ordinance.
just ask the council. Do we feel comfortable moving forward with discussion, or do we need a little more information?
I'm comfortable moving forward with this. I feel like I understand the ordinance.
Okay.
I do. Does everyone else? Ronnie, Tony, here? Yeah, okay.
All right. So maybe we should just jump to the planning commission's recommendations. Okay.
Thanks, Jeff.
You bet. That was easy. So the planning commission did look at this on October 25th and held a public hearing. They came up with several recommendations. 1769030, they are requesting that an additional subsection C be included. Workforce housing provided by employers will require a long-term deed-restricted lease for employees. The second is that 1769040, subsection B.
As you go through those, do you want to actually,
Should we discuss
like,
them?
just
Let's bless
ask?
them. Yeah, let's bless
If
them
we're-
one at a time, if you may.
Sure.
Would that be okay?
Is there any discussion on that, the first one there?
No.
So I think one example that was presented is that, like, of a hotel with possible spaces in the basement that have suitable egress, and using that for workforce housing. And so it's actually like in the same footprint as, and on the same lot.
Exactly.
Would that be practical to have a deed restriction just on those spaces? Typically,
Yes, yeah, we can do that.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, they have to be legally defined in some manner, but as long as we have an enforceable or a definite description of the units involved, we can do that.
I read this to mean that we wanted employers to provide a long-term lease.
Yeah, I know that was a recommendation from the Planning Commission. I have my concerns about whether or not that would truly be enforceable or whether we could actually go that far. It's something I think I want to give some thought to, but I do have some concerns about our police power going that far to regulating the content of or duration of leases.
Well, it just means that if you work at a hotel that has that deed restricted workforce housing that's required by us, and you get a job, that employer is required to provide you a long-term lease. So they can't hold your housing over your head to make you comply with work that may not be something you want to do.
Yeah.
And so it's taking housing leverage out of the equation for the employers.
Yeah, I'm aware of that concern. Just you lose your job, and that also means you lose your housing. Yeah, that is a legitimate concern.
So I think that's what that
is a concern. Yeah.
request. That was what that was.
Okay.
Just so I understand, is the term deed restricted, is that not, are they talking about more like rent control? Like, I know we're not supposed to use that term.
Well,
right?
Like you can't, so it's kind of like you hire them and you give them this like rent controlled housing and then you lose your job. You can't jack the rate.
Right, correct.
Yeah, I think that's what that means. That's a good point.
Does that require a deed restriction, or is that just something that's in the lease?
Well, I mean, let's be clear. Every unit of affordable housing that's developed either under PAD or the workforce housing ordinance will have a LURA, which is essentially a covenant that's recorded against the real estate that specifies the affordability controls and what you can and can't do with that property. But I get the idea.
Ownership, it's checked at point of sale.
Right.
And at rentals, it's checked, and we talked, that was one of the things, whether it was going to be annually or biannually.
Monitoring period.
So it would be on us to send letters to the renters, making sure there's compliance.
Yep.
That would happen. So there would be. It's not like policing. Like it would just be oversight.
Right.
That would be in place.
Didn't mean to derail the discussion.
So I think we support that.
Okay.
I mean, I support it. I didn't mean to say we.
Yeah. I'm for it, because like Chris says, everything else is a very similar sort of deal, so.
Is the rest of the council okay with it?
Within limits. I mean, long-term leases are often like a year, 6 months. So in Utah, you could kick someone out with much less notice, but it seems like 6 months might be kind of an imposition on an employer as well if someone's lost their job for whatever reason. So I might be inclined to impose a shorter time frame for long-term. I'm not sure what that would be ideally.
6 months is about the shortest lease you can.
But if it's month to month.
Do you want to specify not less than 6 months?
What happens if you have someone that has a short, like, season river guide, and it's a 3-month or something along those lines, and now they're locked into a lease that they have to pay for if they have another job somewhere else, not just the employer's side, but if I'm here for a couple of months to work and I have plans to go somewhere else, now I'm locked into paying for a lease that.
About 1 month or more.
Some J1 students only have a 3-month time period in Moab.
Under our code right now, long-term is considered 31 days or longer.
So they're just required to do a lease. This is saying they're just requiring a long-term deed restricted lease.
Right.
At least 31 days.
Do you want to say a year? Do you want to?
I think we're just saying there should be a lease.
Right.
That the employer and the employee sign.
Okay.
That's a really good point.
That that has,
Or they both agree to it and they sign a lease.
Okay, but then you're not preserving that long-term tenancy if, for example, there's an employment action. If the issue is,
If you're gonna require a lease, you could require a term of something like a 30-day notice requirement to evict.
Yeah.
So if they lost their job, they at least had 30 days from that day forward to try and find new housing.
Yeah. Bam. Okay. 2.
Section 1769040, subsection B. We're requesting that it be amended to read the FILC, or fee in lieu of construction, is due and payable at the time of issuance of the building permit. The reason being is that, let's say they do get their final approvals, as the code reads right now, or the draft, and then they do not proceed with the project. So putting it at building permit time, they have to pay their impact fees at that stage anyway, and so it's just one nice big package that we get.
Sounds good.
And
Yes.
it can be a complete building permit application.
Yep.
Good. Section 1769040, they'd like to include an additional subsection D to read, the fee in lieu of construction shall be returned to the developer if not used within a period of time not to exceed 5 years. In other words, they want the city to use the money. Stay on top of this.
Yeah, that looks good to me with the only caveat that if we spent part of their funds, but not all, you might want to say, return the unused portion.
Can we use it?
Well, suppose we're taking their money and we're building affordable housing, but we only use some of it, I don't know.
What was the idea? You get a building permit, but then you never build.
well, I guess the issue is that the city takes the money and doesn't build with it. And, my first thought is that that's a pretty short window to get much done, and that's not a requirement built into state law. And you may be handcuffing yourself, or you may want to have a longer period of time. It's up to you.
I don't understand this.
Yeah, well, there's a body of law, for example, under impact fee law that says that if a municipality collects impact fees and doesn't use them for the purpose, that there are some situations where a party can seek a refund of those impact fees. These are different. What we're talking about, the fee in lieu, it's an exaction, and it is by the ordinance specified to be applied towards projects. And one of the things, affordable housing projects, one of the things that happens is that it takes a while for the money in the fund to build up enough where you can actually use it and do a project. So a 5-year requirement might actually, you might end up not accumulating enough to actually do any good with it.
So what do you recommend, 10 years?
Yeah, we could do 10.
Do you even have to have a date?
You don't have to have a date. You
Yeah,
don't have
I
to
don't
have
want to return money.
Yeah. The
But
impact
you also
fee.
don't want to be, if you, as the developer, you don't want to give the city money thinking that they're not also going to use the money for the intended purposes.
Yeah. The impact fee
That's-
timeline.
The impact fee timeline is a 6-year
6 years.
window,
6 years.
or if that 6-year window comes and the prop money still hasn't been used, you just have to pass an ordinance dedicating it to a specific project, and then you can keep it beyond the 6-year window. So you could do something where you have a 5 or a 6-year window. If we haven't spent it and built something, you then just pass an ordinance dedicating this clump for this project, and then you can retain it past that point.
Can we write that in?
Becomes a tracking issue is what you're saying.
Yeah, and
It
one of the
becomes
things
a huge tracking
I
issue.
wanted to be clear, yeah, it is a tracking issue, and the other thing I wanted to be clear about is this isn't an impact fee, and I don't want to inject ambiguity into this ordinance by importing impact fee-like provisions. Our preference is that people build housing, and that if they don't build housing, that they pay the fee. but the city needs flexibility to accumulate money to build projects, and 5 years may be too short. And I respect the recommendation, but you may want, that may be one that you may or may not want to implement.
Just to be clear, who's making this recommendation?
Planning Commission.
Planning Commission.
And the idea behind it was that the city would, that we would use the money.
Keep
And
progressing,
keep it, yes,
not sit on it.
yeah.
But it was recommended from, yeah, so, I mean, that's something to consider. It was recommended from a developer, so. I say,
So
don't even put it in.
I'd be inclined to, so it's just 5 years, so I'd be inclined to do the 6-year.
I'd
And,
not even put a timeline. We don't have to.
oh,
You don't,
Yeah,
you don't have to.
oh, well
So
then,
you just
okay,
reject the,
okay,
Okay.
then reject. Cool, okay.
The only reason I might not do it, Chris, with your opinion
With
is,
respect, reject with
right,
respect.
with tons.
subject to legal challenge, would this make our case for not being a takings less defensible?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think you've got to have the flexibility to accumulate the money to build the projects. And if it may come in you know, little bits over time, you know, relatively small increments. And we all know how expensive it is to engage in development.
Okay.
So, yeah, I don't think it's a problem.
Okay, thank you.
Number 4.
okay. 1769050, construction requirements, subsection A. It's recommended to adopt the listed standards from ordinance 2018-19 if the pad is not adopted prior to ordinance 2018-20. And the draft says the affordable housing unit should be reviewed under and subject to all performance standards, affordability controls, and other requirements specified in Chapter 1768, Planned Affordable Developments.
Oh, the pad, this is what ties it to the pad?
So Madam Mayor, I do have a question.
Go for it.
Keelan, I thought it was you suggested in the interest of time, getting it in before the deadline here. Does it make any sense even to talk about passing a version of this ordinance, which rather than listing 2 options for a hotel, for example, either the FILC or building his own workforce housing, is we just delete this, do not include the second option. In other words, the only way he's got of complying right now is the FILC. Frankly, because we don't have our act together yet at this point.
Yes,
and then,
we do.
And then amending it later on to add a construction option when we're confident that our pad ordinance is tight. I mean, it's very straightforward in my mind relatively straightforward to just to deal with how much money and all the rest of the constraints without worrying about exactly the requirements for getting it built if the hotel builds it.
So my understanding is that it's important to tie these fees to affordable housing, specific purpose that serves the affordable housing intent.
Yeah, that's the whole point of the effort is to A, generate money that will be used to build affordable housing, or B, actually build affordable housing in conjunction with new commercial development. And when we first started looking at this ordinance was really heavy on the fee element and light on the actual construction element. When you start constructing units, you have to start thinking about what are they going to look like, and how are you going to control eligibility and all that good stuff. And that's where importing the provisions of the PAD ordinance made natural sense. I would hope that we could get all this stuff done in proper order and not have to do kind of PAD light within the assured workforce housing ordinance and then come back to PAD later. But if you tell me that.
We just had such a good conversation about the pad, and I really feel like we're close. Fine for number 4, but let's just move forward and get them passed. Like, let's just point positive. Let's fine to have this just in case, right? Because this is a just in case the pad don't pass, right? Fine, but let's pass the pad. So fine, but let's pass the pad.
Okay.
Fine.
I heard crickets chirping.
I mean, it's basically your safety net.
Yeah,
If the
fine.
pad doesn't
Let's have a
pass.
safety net, but let's also pass the pad.
Fair enough.
I'm not gonna pass the pad until I'm comfortable with it. Yeah, that's all there is to it.
But we could be really comfortable with it on the 13th.
We might.
What's the deadline for the workforce housing?
22nd.
22nd, yeah.
So if next meeting, we don't have a quorum to pass the pad, then we can include this, right? So it's a safety net, and I think we all agree to that. Fine.
Next.
Yeah.
I suspect if we're unprepared, that it might take staff a little bit of time to prepare an alternate pad light that we could actually pass at a special meeting.
That's not exactly what I was suggesting. I was suggesting we pass the workforce thing without a pad lookalike.
What does the pad need? We just went through, we just spent an hour here talking and raising our concerns.
So I'm okay with that plan, but I'm just noting that it's unlikely that Plan B could be carried out at our next meeting without prep. But I'm okay, like, going forward as though it's going to happen.
But if not, then the recommendation to adopt the listed standards.
We would need to prepare basically a contingency version.
Right, but I'm okay, like, going forward as though we're going to pull this off, knowing that if we don't, we'll probably have to have at least one special meeting before the deadline.
Yeah, that's true. To review.
Right, because if we're going forward, if we're pointing positive, then staff is not going to put time into, like, having something that either follows the planning commission's recommendations for pad light, or what we've talked about doing just the fee in lieu option. Because we're not going to be able to, like, come up with a motion that is defensible on the fly. But that's okay in my mind, because we can have special meetings.
Like this one right here.
Like this one right here.
So we could have another meeting to talk about it.
If need be.
Yes.
I'm trying to support you both.
Excellent. Constructive.
It's good. 5, let's go on.
Now it's time for some discussion.
I like that we disagree on policy. That's
fine.
That's good.
There he goes.
It's not the person, it's the policy.
This one's kind of the meat and potatoes of the.
Let's do it.
Yeah, 1769-050 subsection B. It's recommended the table be removed and previously used language be inserted that reads, the construction requirement is satisfied by the construction of 1 unit of affordable housing for every 2,500 square feet of finished floor area of the overnight accommodations. Where the finished floor area of the development is less than 2,500 square feet, the developer should pay the FILC in satisfaction of the affordable housing requirement. It is also recommended when the 2-year review occurs, a matrix that considers costs of land, construction costs per square foot, and city overhead costs if involved in administration and future management of a project should be developed and included in the ordinance. And that way, instead of having the table that is very static, it would, the matrix in theory will ebb and flow with current conditions.
So it's kind of a 2-part.
Can I ask a question about that? Because if you've got a 60,000 square foot hotel, I would divide that by 2,500 to get 24. So that says 24 units. So what's the biggest hotel we've got? Or what's an actual concrete? What's a hotel we've permitted the size?
I can't think of the square footage.
Hoodoo's probably the largest. It's 100 and, oh, man.
Is it like 119?
Let's say 119. 119,000 divided by 2,500 equals 47.6 units. So let's say 48 units. And 48 units. And then if we go the other way.
The FILC way?
The what?
The fee and.
Yeah, the fee in lieu, the 15 point, what is it?
5.7.
15.57 times 60,000
Weren't you doing the 100?
is,
119.
oh, sorry. Okay, 15.57 times 119 is 1.852830 million. So it's almost 2 million. Would 2 million produce 48 units?
2 million barely buys the dirt underneath.
Well,
But the problem is that our Nexus study said the highest we can charge is that 15 point.
No?
Yeah, so,
So I brought the Nexus study.
yeah, and I had some questions about that too, Mayor. And just so that the council knows, the matrix that's shown on 050B, what it did was, and credit for this goes to the county that helped to devise this, but what they did is they went to the BAE Nexus study and said, okay, how do we translate the fee that we've talked about into units and that would actually be constructed? And how many units you construct necessarily depends on how much rent you can get, and that in turn depends on the affordability level on those. And so this matrix essentially tries to come up with the required number of units based on the size of the development, applying that $15.57 per square foot figure for hotel development, assuming the certain, basic construction costs that are outlined in the study. So what was done here was an attempt to try to make sure that the unit cost or the unit requirement tracks as closely with the Nexus study as possible, for lack of a better term.
Chris, can you clarify, what exactly are you calling the matrix?
It's 1569-050B.
The one that's marked as remove on
Yes.
page 52?
That was
Looks
the
like this.
recommendation from the planning
that's
commission.
that's the
Yeah,
original.
that's what they want to.
The pre-planning commission version.
Yeah, that's what they want to remove, and I guess my recommendation is don't.
I am very confused because I think we all got emails from some people, and I got the impression that using the matrix for calculating fee in lieu, the proposal was to do that in place of the 1557 flat rate, not take it out. So I'm very confused at this point.
So I also felt extreme confusion. I think this is what they're saying. Instead of this chart, go to this alternative calculation.
Where do I find the calculation?
That is what I said to myself, but I think what it is a narrative and it's not a matrix.
Are you talking about the comments that were made in here?
So did the planning commission provide a alternative matrix other than this?
No. So what happened were there were two versions of this document that went out. The first version that Chris had sent out did not have this table included. That version had this language that they are referring to in B, which basically said you have to construct 1 unit per 2,500 square feet of floor area. Then the table came out and a new version of the document came forward, they had based their recommendation on that previous version of the document before the table was inserted. They felt that the table actually provided a more concrete number of units that would be required for the development.
The formula.
The formula in there.
The 1 unit of affordable housing for every 2,500 square
I
feet.
think at the end of the day, again, the idea is, what do you all at this point think makes the most sense? And, you know, and what do you feel is defensible given what the Nexus studies have provided?
Well, that's what I was going to comment on, because I understand why the Planning Commission came to that 2,500 number. Makes super sense. However, the table 6 maximum justifiable hotel impact fee that was in the Nexus study, which is what we paid jointly with the county, like $90,000, so that we wouldn't get sued. That would give us the number that would be the defensible number for charging hotels is the 15.57.
Correct.
$15.57. So I totally get what they're saying. And yeah, will $15.57, if applied, build enough units? Maybe not, but that is what is defensible. And justifiable in our Nexus study, which is our only, or is our single document. And I said to Chris, put in the ordinance, go deep, like charge as much as we can, because we can always back off. And so this table, this matrix, in your opinion, pushes it as far as we defensibly can.
Yes, and the flip side of that is that if there's if the fee in lieu of construction is substantially different than the actual unit cost, if you're actually building units, you're going to get distortions. People are going to say, no, I'm not going to build any units. I'll just pay the fee. And so the attempt was made to make sure that the required number of units that you're going to build match essentially what you would have to pay if you did the fee in lieu. I mean, and I'm not the author of this, but the methodology is pulled directly from the Nexus study. And if you'll recall, the first draft of our ordinance, it was heavy on fees. It didn't have actual unit construction requirements. And after talking with a number of people, we felt that we were much better served by saying to developers, we want you to build units, not just pay money to the city and have us deal with it later. So anyways, this was the end product of that.
And the question would be whether or not we would even honor a fee in lieu. I mean, back when we originally talked about this housing ordinance before it went to Planning Commission, the thing I said to you was, in our meeting, you guys might remember, was like, do we want to have that even be available?
Right. I mean, if your goal is to build units, you want people
to build units.
Actually doing it.
So we could actually throw out, but I mean, I don't know that I'm suggesting that.
Well, I mean, the point, though, that was made to us from some members of the Planning Commission is that there's nowhere in the world you can build a house for $15.
That's a misunderstanding.
It's a misunderstanding. Will you explain that? Yeah.
So the fee is based on the gap between what people earn and what they can afford. So the idea is not that you build housing for all your workers, or that this is to address the gap between between the wages that some fraction of the workforce of the jobs that they generate are paid and what they can afford. So.
And I think there might have been some confusion about the notion that this $15, per square footage, that is a calculation based on the square footage of the hotel, not the square footage of what you're building for affordable housing.
It's not a cost per square foot for the house.
Affordable housing, right.
And the Nexus study is dense, and you have to read it a few times to really absorb it. And sometimes I have to go back myself. So I don't fault anyone for misunderstanding that. I agree.
So the $15 a square foot at 2,500 square feet maps into about $40,000 per unit. I mean, which obviously isn't enough to build.
That's what we're saying. That's not the calculation.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the misunderstanding.
Yeah.
That's why I think the suggestion of $100 sounded good if that's what you're trying to.
It's great,
even
but
that's
it's not
really low
feasible.
for what. Well, right. That's not. Yeah. It's
So-
apples and oranges, really.
But there is this table 7 that does show a maximum justifiable fee and then a maximum financially feasible fee.
And you're
Chris?
looking at the Nexus study.
Yeah. Chris, can you just interpret that for us?
Oh, boy. Is that in phase 2?
It is, you know what, I'm just gonna hand it to you, because this is gonna be easier than you looking it up. So here is where the maximum justifiable hotel impact fee is.
Yeah.
But then what is this down here?
So I'm in favor of keeping the original language and table myself, just in the interest of possibly moving this conversation along.
Yeah.
Mayor, as I sit here today, that differentiation between maximum justifiable and maximum feasible, I think what they were talking about was that you could, based on the market, you could justify a higher fee in lieu. But if you did that, it might make the project no longer viable because it would consume the rate of return, the profit that the developer was planning on getting on completion of the development. So you had to scale it back based on market conditions. I think that's what that meant.
That's right, yeah.
I think that's what that meant.
Okay.
I'll give this back to you so you don't lose it, and then I have to read it again tomorrow.
Put it in the bathroom.
So there was no conceivable situation where you can charge more than the 1557?
That was my conclusion from the study. If you look at phase 2 of the study, that's what they recommended.
Because that's like definitely the key question.
Because I thought there was like we were presented with 3 columns at our joint meeting, like the maximum, the moderate, and ones we're probably not gonna get sued with.
And then this says maximum impact fee.
Yeah, it was definitely not an impact fee.
Yeah, right.
What?
Not an impact fee.
Right.
I think, yeah, the 1557 was the maximum that was justifiable and feasible.
Yeah, that's good.
Which I have my copy handy.
Oh, forgive me, Chris, I realize I'm still confused too. In the table on page 3, across from hotel, motel, 4 categories of housing, all at 60,000 square feet and $15 a square foot. But I don't understand the column labeled affordable housing unit mitigation.
Yeah. So if you see the calculation at the bottom, you see a 35,000 square foot hotel. They were all assuming the same size floor area for a development. And you multiply that by the AH mitigation factor of 10.87. That assumes a level of affordability for the units that are actually going to be sold. And so how many units you have to build depends on the level of affordability that they are going to be offered at in the marketplace. And so that if you're offering extremely low income units that have very, very low rents, you're only going to be required to build a very, very small number of those because the return is so little on them. In contrary to, or you know, if you're offering,
we've seen that before. Okay, I got it now.
Does that make sense?
Before. Thank you.
Maybe I'm not explaining it very well.
No, you are, and I think he gets it.
We can go on.
Yeah.
I think,
Yeah.
you pointed out it's the return. That's what they're.
So I think we're gonna stick with the matrix and that calculation, but there is something to discuss before we move on, and that was the original question that you wanted to ask when we started, Mike, which was, before we were just talking about hotels, but in this matrix, we actually include a couple other things.
Right.
Condominiums and townhomes.
And yeah, and that was done, it's justified under the matrix study, under the matrix study, the Nexus study, excuse me, the hours
No
late.
spoon.
Under the Nexus study. It was justified under the Nexus study, and again, I was asked to look at those types of developments that are available for overnight lodging accommodations. And so it's only those types of units that are available for overnight lodging. So you can probably think of various projects around town that are condominium type units that are.
Would that be like Entrada?
Yes.
Entrada is a condo. I
That's
don't
right.
know about townhomes.
And it all depends on the zoning. I mean, the requirement is tied to overnight lodging. So Jeff, we have certain zoning designations where overnight lodging is allowed, others where it's not. And so the fee is for those types of uses. And again, we were trying to be as expansive with this as we could. The county goes a little bit further with their proposed ordinance, actually going into, actually big homes and that sort of thing. My conclusion was that the fee in lieu, or this, this assured housing requirement, the nexus is closest, if you will, when you've got hotel development. When I build a hotel, I know I've got to have employees, and those people have to have a place to live. And to me, that link between that particular impact and the housing that will be needed because of that construction is really clear. That's a really close link. There's also, if you are building townhomes or condos that are used for overnight lodging, those operate similar to a hotel in that you have staff, you have maintenance, you have housekeepers, you have all of those people that are going to have, going to work at that facility. But it's maybe not as clear as a hotel. But anyway, that's where the thinking was, that we try to capture those types of overnight lodging developments.
Are we, as a council, okay not to include large single-family homes?
Yes.
Yes.
I'm okay including them.
I'm wondering if the table should be clear that it's condos and townhomes in zones that permit short-term rentals.
Yeah, and I think that's elsewhere.
If they were to record a deed that said occupancy is 31 days or more, would that exempt them from this ordinance?
That would mean they are not doing short-term rentals.
Yeah, so that would be a way that they could, if you're building townhomes in a commercial zone, but you intend to do long-term, you could do that. And that's a way for a developer to get out of that if they were doing long-term rental.
Okay, so Chris, let me ask you about a legal challenge, which we may get.
Was that your question?
Yeah.
Did I interrupt you? I'm
No,
sorry.
no.
Okay.
Do you expect significantly greater difficulty defending the ordinance against a legal challenge if we include townhomes and condominiums, which, as you say, are a little more diffuse in their nexus?
It's hard to predict. As I said, if I'm attaching this fee to just new second homes, that to me is maybe a bridge too far, in the sense that if I'm building let's say I'm from Oregon and I come here and I build a big fancy second home, it's not clear that that's going to generate employment impacts per se. It might, but the link is not as clear as it is with a hotel.
Sure.
And then there's a spectrum there: townhomes and condominiums. I think they also have employment impacts. And if you note, the fee is less for those because they're maybe not as highly labor intensive.
Well, I guess my argument would be, if you felt like we were significantly more likely to win our expected lawsuit, if we didn't have condos and townhomes, not a whole lot of money has been lost, all right? Because you you only get $5 instead of $15 kind of thing
Yeah.
for townhomes.
You know, and the flip side of that is also is that I could see the hotel owners saying, this isn't fair because you're exempting all these other people that are creating impacts.
I believe that was the argument that Randy Day made. That
That's right.
He felt that we were isolating one sector. So what is our response to that?
Well, our response to that, I think part of the response is that the Nexus study found that trying to assess this fee in lieu of construction, or assess the fee here to all new commercial development might be confiscatory, meaning that there's some commercial development that just couldn't support it. It would be rendered non-viable because the rates of return for that particular development are not high enough to withstand a fee of any sort. That was the big argument, was that, and the other, I think that the other argument that went with this is that this is a tourism town, and we've experienced a tourism-related boom and employment-related housing impacts that are directly traceable to condominiums, townhomes, hotels.
Yeah. It's a highly disproportionate, we're out of balance, basically, and there's not the same level of growth in restaurants or other service-related industry, elements of the industry compared to overnight accommodations.
But I see the argument that if I'm building a restaurant, I'm going to have employment-related impacts, and those people are going to have a place to live. The problem is I'm not earning the rates of return if I build a restaurant that are comparable to what the lodging-related uses are generating.
Can I clarify a few things, Chris? So with the 2,500 square feet, so if you have less than 2,500 square feet, you pay the FILC, but if you're more than 2,500 square feet, are you required to build housing, or you have the option of the housing or the FILC or the...
That's a good point.
I think you have to pay.
It was only if you were using the construction requirement, then you have to build the 1 unit per 2,500. But then anything under that, what are you going to do? It'd be left over, and so you're just forgiven what they felt was that.
Yeah, so you're saying small, like a small development. Let's say I'm building a store or something, or a small level of commercial development, or a remodel that's adding space on. It may not add very much space, and you wouldn't. The fee generated would not be enough to justify building a unit. I think
that's actually not my question. My question is it up to, say I'm building a small hotel, is it up to me as the hotel builder to decide, oh, I want to build a unit versus pay the FILC, or if my development is larger than 2,500 square feet, am I automatically required to build at least 1 unit?
Yeah, I mean, what our ordinance says is that that the developer has the option. That the developer has the option to either construct or provide an appropriate number of affordable units in conjunction with the development, or pay the fee.
So given Emily's earlier comment about FILC and the theoretical question, if you even want to offer it, what are the drawbacks, since we know that it's much more expensive to build and provide a unit, but certain people, what are the drawbacks to requiring it?
To requiring...
To not having the FILC as an option.
Or only having it for stuff that's under 2,500 square feet?
Yeah, that's where the
Tell me what the Planning Commission concern was.
Well, that's where they were going, but I think, haven't we gone back to the original language? It says the construction requirement is determined by dividing the finished floor area or total units of the type of overnight accommodation.
The two were intended to be functionally equivalent, and you could have a situation where a developer might say, I can maximize the use of my site by paying the fee and earn the best return. Right. I'll just pay the fee, and I don't have to administer housing. I don't have to deal with all that. And there are many situations, or if you have site constraints, I can't squeeze units in on my site, I'm going to have to pay the fee. That seems to me to be what's going to drive that decision making for a developer.
But if it's so much cheaper to pay the fee, what's the incentive for anyone to build units?
It's
Yeah.
not.
It's not
cheap-
required at some point.
It's not cheaper to pay the fee. I mean,
That's the idea, that's the
the idea is the
approach.
fee versus the actual unit construction costs. They're derived from the same set of base numbers.
Well, we did do the quick math though, and it didn't.
Well, I mean, I think there's probably some scenarios where it would be extra burdensome just on a developer to provide that housing if that's, I'm not saying that's true in every case, but I could envision a scenario where a developer maxes out the, they have a small lot for their actual hotel. They build the hotel on that. But so then if they didn't have the ability to pay the fee, if they weren't allowed to pay the fee, they'd have to go find another lot, develop that as housing. Maybe they're not in that business. Maybe it's not something that's their bailiwick. I don't know. Maybe it's a timing issue with land availability. I don't know. I guess you could take a hard line and say no fee in lieu is an option, but that would definitely be a significant step further in terms of burdening those who do overnight accommodation development. It just would be, for better or worse.
I'm disinclined to get rid of the filk.
How about you, Karen?
I mean, what's our intention?
I don't think anyone's ever called it filk before. It's making me giggle.
It's in there.
Because fee in lieu is like what I've always heard. I haven't heard anyone say filk.
And I'm not even saying necessarily get rid of it, but are there certain circumstances where your only option is to build, and if you're below that and you don't fill up, mathematically come out to a whole unit, then you pay a fee for that portion. But I mean, if the idea is to get units.
Right. It seems like inclusionary zoning for residential development, totally makes sense to just require units because they're building residential. And so with condos and townhomes, even if it's commercially zoned and all the other ones are getting, or STRs, that would be a place where I could see just saying, if you're over a minimum development size, then you start having units, since they're building them anyway. And they're residential.
All the literature I've seen is like, don't give them the option to pay out, make them build it. But I hear the reality.
So much of what I've read about inclusionary zoning was in reference to residential development.
I've just seen lots sit undeveloped because the developer didn't build them. And they're just hoping private sector will.
Oh.
Like in Crested Butte, for example.
What do you mean they're sitting undeveloped? They had to buy the land?
So actually, the CBMR, Crested Butte Mountain Resort, with the town of Mount Crested Butte, entered into an assured housing, the assured housing was there and entered into an agreement where they developed a big chunk of land and then they set aside for development. So not only did they pay, but they did all of the infrastructure and created like the road and lots stubbed, like infrastructure stubbed to each lot. And those lots are still sitting undeveloped right now because two things. One, CC&Rs are pretty fancy, but two, all the builders are building homes where they're gonna make more money. So the lots are sitting undeveloped.
So in that case, they did sort of a fancy land in lieu. I mean, we have a...
They did fancy land in lieu.
Because we have a land in lieu provision in the draft ordinance as well.
Right.
But it sounds like there it would have been better to say, give us less land but build on it, as opposed to, and that sounds like a learning opportunity.
Well, they also lack affordable housing developers that we have, so maybe that'll be the difference, but.
It wasn't clear to me reading this. Do they still have the option to not only provide an empty piece of land, but also to produce an existing structure? say if they have, I don't know, they happen to own a house or whatever, to use that?
You know, an earlier draft we had talked about conversion, like you could take an existing structure and convert it to affordable housing. We took that out of this draft because it kind of felt like that was going backwards in terms of solving the problem, you know, taking existing housing out of stock to satisfy this requirement.
It does say construct or provide
Yeah.
an appropriate number of affordable housing.
Yeah, and then you asked, your second question dealt with the dedication requirement or the dedication of land, and to me that seems to be a fairly, that's probably what happened in the case of CBMR that you're talking about.
Dedication of land.
Yeah, they dedicated land, and they didn't have the money to build it once it was dedicated. I view that as, first off, it's entirely discretionary with the city. We'd have to evaluate it and decide it was something we wanted to do. I could only see it making sense where it was the right parcel in the right place, the right time, and you know you'd have to be convinced that, as a council, that it was a good swap to get this chunk of land that you could build on later to satisfy a particular developer's.
Yeah, because the soils were bad. There was a big drop off for like half.
Oh, well, that explains why. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean they were tricky to develop, but I mean. Crested Butte is tricky to develop.
That's right, and our ordinance,
Snows
our draft makes it entirely discretionary with the council, where you'd have to get an appraisal, you'd have to determine that you want this parcel, that it's roughly equivalent, it's satisfactory for your needs, and I view that as, you know, it's kind of a unicorn. Maybe it comes along, maybe it doesn't.
Okay. Did the planning commission, what did they say? Did they have this discussion whether or not to have a fee, or was it just assumed that the fee was going to happen in lieu?
They accepted all three options
as reasonable.
Viable, yeah.
And didn't
No, I don't.
say we should throw out an option. Was it presented to them that that was a possibility?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, a traditional exaction is a dedication of land or property as a condition for land use approval. And so it can be both real property, it can be money, and some flexibility might be appropriate because some situations might justify one or the other.
Okay. Are we okay with the matrix and
In the original language.
original language then? Yes. I see 2 yeses. Are there yeses to my right?
The original language, which is to say you don't want to adopt the language in the, under B here.
So do you have the color-coded copy?
I have the marked up, yes.
Okay, so the green is not the original language. That's what the planning commission was recommending. The red, which says the construction requirement is determined by dividing the finished floor area or total units of the type. That would remain in the ordinance.
Okay. So stuff.
Yeah, so do you understand what we're saying yes or no to?
I don't.
Okay, so let's just break it down. So the first thing is hotel, motel, condominiums, townhomes. Those are the typologies that are going to receive the opportunity to provide housing. Does everybody feel good about that?
Yes.
Okay. Then the second piece is the and that includes that amount. The second piece is it's 9:15. My mind just went blank. Help me out. Whether or not a developer can, a hotel builder can say, okay, here's what I'm going to do. You can have land, is one. You can have money, is two. Or I'm just going to build the units, is three.
Are we considering the land option as well?
Yeah, so those are the three options that.
And the land option requires city concurrence. Your council would have to approve.
with a whole bunch of requirements and stuff.
Right.
So are we cool with allowing for all three? Kaylin,
For hotels, yes.
for hotels, but not for condos or
Well,
townhomes?
as a result of this conversation, I'm wondering if since they're building residential units when they're building condos and townhomes, if we just want to say if they're above a certain threshold, if we were,
Make some of them
if we
affordable housing?
favor
Oh, right.
a unit.
That's what Ronnie was saying, right?
Okay,
Yeah.
that's what I was not understanding.
So that's what I'm asking.
Specific though to townhomes and condominiums.
Because those are already
Right.
residential units.
Right, makes
Right.
sense.
But they might be in commercial zone.
Right, but this builder's building residential units, like they don't have to go learn how to build something else.
So it'd be like, let's take Entrada, for example. How many units are Entrada?
47.
47.
They'd have to
So-
dedicate a certain number of those as
Of the
affordable.
47,
Okay.
the percentage that would be calculated would be roughly, how many units?
2.
2, maybe more than that, for 47 units? Oh, I don't know, it's based on square footage. Some
I
units,
was totally guessing.
some units,
Yeah,
and
some
so then
units.
somebody's gonna live permanently in that,
Or 14 people, isn't that how many
Next
tourists
to-
go one?
yeah, next to
They're
nightly
bunk beds.
rentals. It's important to
right.
think about. So they'd be living next to nightly rentals, a couple few units.
Well, those aren't all necessarily nightly rentals though either, just for the record, right? People do live in those things year round.
Right.
Really?
And then they would be deed restricted, so they couldn't put their unit on Airbnb, right?
Right.
Because it would be deed restricted per the ordinance and all the paperwork that would come out of that, right? All right, I'm good with that.
So under the pad, could you build Entrada today if it was
But are we
80%
requiring-
affordable?
The pad, you
Well,
could build an Entrada Plus, right? You'd
I
be
mean,
able
so
to.
same footprint, so we could potentially have the same problems, okay.
But
So
I
you're
don't-
saying condos and townhomes don't get the option to pay or
Well,
do land?
Above a certain threshold.
That's what I'm wondering. Yeah, because they're already building residential units, so like rather than us having
That's a
to
good point.
go through and maybe we could even say, hey, we've got this pot of money from the hotels, like we also want to pay in and you can build some more units while you're at it because you're building a high-density residential development.
So let's think about it, because we're gonna come to a vote, unless you all wanna vote tonight, which I don't know that we're there, good. So let's think about it. Let's mull that question over and come with a decision at our meeting about that particular piece. Fair? 'Cause
The decision
yeah.
is whether to do the land
Yeah.
possession or build or fee and
Or specifically for condos or townhomes. So I think we all agree that hotels get all three options. But for condos and townhomes, maybe we don't give them the option to pay.
So we can bring you a couple of options on how to manifest that.
And it would be
suggestion.
interesting, I don't know how hard it would be to calculate how many units would have been actualized in Entrada.
Based on their square footage?
Based on this
We could do
ordinance.
that. It'll take some time.
Yeah,
Because they're big.
Okay.
it'd be interesting to know what that number
They're
is.
good-sized units, yeah.
Any other things about the ordinance, or is there still more?
Yes,
How many?
a few.
Okay.
1769-050 subsection D. Let's see. What it actually talks about, the mix of income types for affordable housing units will be determined, and they would like by the city on a case-by-case basis. But by the city added into that.
Okay.
1769, again, 050. They're requesting that a new subsection E be added to read, in owner-provided housing, employees shall receive first preference for available dwellings.
Great. That might be tricky, but
Yeah.
Chris, is that too tricky?
We could probably make that work.
It's all in the Lura.
1769-060, dedication. We would like the paragraph, or the paragraph 4 to be amended to read, the value of the property must be confirmed by current appraisals from 2 properly licensed and qualified appraisers, one who is chosen by the city and one chosen by the developer. The developer shall bear all costs.
Fine with me.
BEAR.
Appraisals are very expensive.
Yeah, it's at least 1,000
They can
plus
be
for a commercial. It could be up to 5,000.
$1,000 a pop, and that's my only reservation about that language, but.
Who made that suggestion?
The planning commission.
You know,
The planning commission, I don't
Was it an appraiser?
No. I mean, the concern was that, there's the ability to contact an appraiser and say, hey, this is how much I need this to come in for. And lo and behold, that's what your appraisal comes in for. And it was basically that you have an independent
It's a
appraisal.
fair concern.
Yeah.
I suppose if the city wasn't convinced of an appraisal, they would just say, no, we're not doing it.
Agreed. Then the city would get one.
Yeah, I guess you could do that too.
The developer would get an appraisal. If the appraisal came in, the city was like, this smells bad. Then the city would just get an independent appraisal. And then the developer would bear the cost. I mean, that's all pre-development costs.
If there's 2, I would be inclined to pay for our appraisal. Just in this sort of negotiation, I think it might be worth the good faith.
Then you probably wouldn't want to require that there be 2 appraisals for every development.
Because if the appraisal came in that the developer got when we were like, that makes sense, then we'd be done.
You guys are much better at this than I am, but I just know from all my years of reviewing other engineers' work, it's who you know, and, I don't know what's going on. I mean, I'm wondering how much appraisals are really worth. This is what I'm trying to say.
Well, for financing purposes, they're worth quite a bit.
I understand that.
I mean, if your appraisal doesn't come in at what you are hoping for, your bank's not gonna loan on
But
it.
that's not my question. I don't know. I see your point, sure.
That's the last suggestion, isn't it?
There was one question looming. When are these housing units constructed? That isn't in here. So if they're going to construct it on site, at what point is it the first thing? Is it in the middle of the project, or is it at the end?
Before a C of O.
Before they get to use their
The hotel.
structure,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe we just put some language that says that units required under this section will be constructed concurrently with development.
I think what Jeff's saying, though, is if the project comes in large enough that it's in phases, and you're going to do multiple C of Os, phase 1 gets a C of O, phase 2 gets a C of O, phase 3 gets a C of O, and they plan on building all of these in the last phase.
First C of O.
I would make a suggestion you do a percentage that if you're doing 500 units and 100 are this, then 20% of each phase has to match that ratio, that same ratio of units per phase.
Okay.
Seem reasonable?
Or first C of O.
Are we talking, which ordinance are we talking? Are we talking PAD or?
No, we're
Okay, so let's put it in context. So we've got Lions Back that has several phases, and they, in their phasing, and
All
of
the
course,
employee
this is
units
already
are on
gone.
the back phase.
Yeah,
they are.
the employee units are not the first or second phase of the development. And so if this is, when this is enacted and enforced, I think that it would be difficult for a developer to phase housing units.
Why?
I just think it would.
If they're not incorporated into that phase, say, first phase is here, last phase is over here, or then you're running the infrastructure, and, I mean, you have to get that infrastructure from this phase clear to that phase in order to develop that. I mean, I don't know
But
that that's.
at the end of the day, that's a design consideration they could take in. If they knew up front that's the dealio, you take that into consideration. It may be somewhat of an imposition. I can see that for sure. But I also would say, at the end of the day, getting these things built, the point of having the employee housing available is because you're going to need the employees when you build these phases, right? Even as it's going.
Since it's the end of the day, I will agree with you.
Oh, finally.
You're right.
Thank you.
You're right.
I'll take it. Sweet.
But only one.
Yeah, it's fine. That's all I needed.
Is everybody okay with that? A phased requirement? So if phase one is 30% of the overall development, then 30% of the housing.
Mm-hmm.
So is then it 30% of the money, 30% of the land, 30% of the
I'll bring something
construction?
back to you.
That makes sense.
Okay.
Keeping in mind they could, off-site building of housing is an option, which may.
I think the county's HDH does exactly that, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, we're not talking about the county here.
I know, I mean, just the point is, they're thinking through the same issues that we're considering, that's all.
Okay, so any final thoughts about the assured workforce housing policy? Okay, seeing none.
I think we have a question.
And we are.
Can I ask?
It's totally not appropriate. However, you have been such an advocate for affordable housing. Audrey Graham, will you come up and in the microphone just share with us whatever you want?
Okay, I'm Audrey Graham.
Thank you for being here for this
Are we
whole
totally
meeting.
out to lunch and all of this? I mean,
Not at all. This is
How many boards are you speaking for?
I'm speaking for no one but myself. No, that's all right.
She's like, I got this. I've been kneeling and moving and trying for so long. You think I need a chair?
This is really quick.
Take the chair.
Just if you're going to do the fee in lieu, then I would suggest, so that's on number 040, section 040, under C, where you say these funds shall be held and accounted for in a separate fund, which shall be used solely for the acquisition, construction, maintenance, or development of affordable housing. I would just add the word management of affordable housing.
Sure.
Because that's going to be a huge thing, and they don't know who is going to pay for that otherwise. So I just think, to be safe, for example, if you are going to ask the Housing Authority or some other agency.
brilliant.
She is brilliant.
No,
Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for your brilliance and your.
Brilliance, yes. Brilliance.
Audrey, when's your birthday? I'm just curious. Late April, because if it was anywhere close, then this could also be a birthday gift to Audrey, who's been working so hard for affordable housing for so long. All right, any comments? Any other comments?
Yes, 070A, if on the basis of individual development cost, employment load, or other similar data, an employment believes that the FILC is excessive. So I was just wondering, is it just the FILC, or is it any of the three?
Yeah, I think probably I should make that the FILC or the construction requirement. The other thing I was, in looking, at the cases that have attacked exactions like this, what I want to say is that if somebody wants to provide their own justification for what the fee should be, they should use a methodology similar to or nearly identical to what we used in the Nexus study. That was my.
So would they, if somebody wants to challenge us, so there's the take us to court, or there's like do your own Nexus study?
Well, in other words, we've got sort of an escape clause that says if you think your fee's way too high, given your particular development, that you can come in and justify the fee based on your own cost rationale. And the only way that works, in my opinion, is if you use a methodology that is basically identical to what would BAE developed. If you use your own methodology, it's apples to oranges.
What Kaylin is saying is it's the requirements generally, not just the FILC that should be.
Right. And I think that's okay.
Any other comments? Should I call for a motion to adjourn after thanking planning staff for sticking through this with us?
So moved.
Thank you, Tawny. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Kalen. Any further discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes 5-0. We're adjourned.